IB Nation, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. It's Tuesday, August 8th. Notre Dame is getting ready to believe I have practice 12 tonight. We'll be in attendance, so I'm very excited about that. Thought today would be a good day to cover a couple topics. Obviously, you've got some top 25 rankings coming out. Wanted to talk about that. Wanted to talk about my rankings. Finally was able to get my IB top 25 done. Have an article coming out on that here coming up soon, but I'm going to obviously go over that with y'all today. I'm going to release my top 25 and do what I think we all wish people would do when they do a top 25, which is talk about it and explain why you voted for what you voted. I'll explain what my top 25 is. And then at the end, we're going to talk a little Notre Dame recruiting. And the premise of today's recruiting topic is basically, there's a lot of angst about this 2024 recruiting class. Notre Dame has done some really good things. There's some areas where maybe people are a little bit concerned. But when you talk to certain people around the program, obviously their view is different, and that's always going to be true, right? Like staffs aren't saying like, oh, we took a bunch of bad players, but the premise is going to be, we're going to learn a ton about this coaching staff from an evaluation process with how this 24 class turns out. And I'm going to talk about, just kind of why that is and some of my thoughts on it. And the same is true for myself. I think, this is a class that's going to challenge me, and is whether or not I'm good at evaluating players in certain situations and certain positions and things like that. And so you put your reputation on the line and you see how kids pan out, and we'll talk about those players and what that means today. And I was able to star some questions for the mailbag. Obviously, I'm going to be doing a solo show today, so it's going to be very, very hard for me to star things once the show starts. So I'll do my best, but since today's not your typical Wednesday rundown, I'm going to try and do my best to still have a mailbag at the end. So it'll be a little different when one person's doing it. I see a lot of people down there talking about the hat I got on today. This is a new hat. I actually was at the Notre Dame bookstore on Sunday. After my wife and I went to lunch, we went to the bookstore. We hadn't bought the shirts for the year yet. She always likes to buy those. So I bought those for Ange and I, and we got some for my mom and dad for when they come in town. And then I wanted to check out the new hat store. I was actually surprised. The bookstore has a completely different layout. When you used to walk in, you'd go to the left and the hats would be like way in the back. They're now sort of in the center, where they used to have like a lot of the antique stuff on the first floor. So they had a lot of new hats. In the past, I haven't really liked the Notre Dame's hats, to be completely real with you. And just, they didn't fit well. They didn't look good. I wanted to buy more than two. I ended up buying two hats yesterday. I wanted to buy more, but I had to, can't go crazy, right? Because obviously it's a little expensive in the bookstore. So if you like this hat and you want a hat like this, you can actually get it at the Notre Dame bookstore, the Hammonds bookstore. So I don't know if it's online or not. I got it in the bookstore. So this is not something that we sell in the Irish Breakdown store. I wish we could sell hats like this. Like, we have trucker hats, but it doesn't look like this. And we have obviously the IB hats, but the logo looks a little bit different. So that's what I got rocking on today. So I got some new gear. Angela got some new gear. We got some stuff for the dogs. Angela wanted to get them new bandanas. She always puts bandanas on them, Notre Dame bandanas on them during football season. So we got that going on today. But I want to talk about Notre Dame and the top 25. That's going to be topic number one today. And it's not going to be so much a criticism of other people's top 25s. I just want to kind of talk about the top 25 and talk about, some of the concerns that people have, some of the rankings that certain people have for certain teams, and get into, I'll share some thoughts on certain teams, but some of that I'm going to save for the end of the show. And as I look through it, my rankings for a lot of schools aren't that far off. My ranking for Notre Dame is off with some people, but not by a ton. There's a couple schools that a lot of people have ranked in the top 25 that I just don't. I'll get into some of that. But, first I wanted to dive into where Notre Dame is right now in the top 25. And when you look at the preseason polls, I did say something yesterday that the last time Notre Dame was ranked number 13 in the coaches poll was 1988. That was incorrect. I had the AP and the coaches polls that year backwards. It was actually 12th in the coaches poll and 13th in the AP poll. So I had those backwards, but the ranking is close. And the point stands, which is, I think, when you look at a team that begins the season ranked at a certain spot, you think, well, is that team really a championship contender? And my whole point is, and this is a kind of a conversation that I had with a buddy of mine last night, and this is what kind of prompted me to want to talk about this show. And he was convincing me that Michigan is going to beat Ohio State this year based on what they've done in recent seasons. And then when I told him that the team I was most concerned about this season was Clemson, he thought I was nuts. And so I kind of pushed back a little bit. I was like, well, you got to pick a lane, man. You can't tell me that Ohio State's going to get beat by Michigan because of what happened the last 2 years, but then tell me I'm nuts for being concerned about Clemson when Notre Dame stomped Clemson last year. So, last season doesn't matter a ton when it comes to predicting what's going to happen at the end of the season. I do, however, think that what happened last year does need to have a bigger say in where you start the top 25. There has to be some sort of foundation for a starting point. And I think what can happen when you get too much into projection is you can lose sight of, really just what a team can be, right? And you can also lose sight of history. And I know that we always look at like Alabama started, seasons ranked high and all those type of things. But at the end of the day, I mean, we've seen plenty of teams either start high and drop and then come back up, or teams that start low and come back up. Obviously, Notre Dame, and as I mentioned before, the last time Notre Dame won a national championship, they started 12th and 13th in the coaches and AP poll, respectively. In 2012, Notre Dame started the season unranked in the AP poll, completely unranked, and obviously went 12-0. And we've certainly seen that from Notre Dame in plenty of years where Notre Dame is not ranked very high and ends up being a pretty good football team. But I do think that when you're looking at a top 25, a preseason top 25, I do tend to put a little bit more emphasis on what happened, because that's the only really knowns that we know, right? Like, we know what certain players can do. We know of a school's track record for producing at certain positions. So you may say, hey, this particular team loses their quarterback, and so they should be this or they should be that. But then you got to look at the history of how has this team overcome quarterback losses in the past? Has it been a good thing for them, a negative thing for them? So I think there's a lot of aspects you have to look at, recent history being one. And I think that should carry as much, if not more, weight on projection for what a team can be. And you'll see that reflected in my ranking as well. And so when you get into the conversation about where Notre Dame is ranked in the preseason top 25 and where they should be ranked, I think that has to be taken into consideration, because Notre Dame does still have a lot to prove this season. I just tend to think this team is going to be a lot better than a lot of people think that it's going to be, but we'll find out how that's going to play out. So where is Notre Dame in the preseason top 25 right now, and where should they be? The AP poll does not come out until Monday, so we won't know what the AP ranking is until Monday, but we did see Notre Dame obviously come out ranked in the coaches poll yesterday. And when I got a chance to look at the coaches poll, I don't really to be honest with you, I don't put as much stock in the coaches poll as I do the AP poll, because we kind of know how the coaches poll goes. Maybe it's some coaches, other teams it's not. I didn't have necessarily any huge disagreements with it outside of maybe a few teams. I think Oklahoma being in it is I just don't get the Oklahoma infatuation. Texas A&M being a top 25 team, I didn't understand that. I can understand why other teams are ranked where they are. And then you look at where Notre Dame is at number 13. The only really big beef that I had, I mean, there's teams that are ahead of Notre Dame in the AP or in the coaches poll that I have behind Notre Dame. However, there's really only one team that I just emphatically would say, no, that team should not be ahead of Notre Dame, and that's Texas. But I only have Texas a couple spots below Notre Dame. A little bit of a tease on that one. So I think the 13 ranking for Notre Dame in the coaches poll is fair. I don't have a big issue with it. It's lower than what I would have them, but it's in that range. I will say this, though. It's the bottom of the range. I think when you look at Notre Dame's preseason range, I think it's, I've kind of gone back and forth on this. I've broadened it a little bit. To me, it's anywhere between 9 and 13, maybe 8 and 13. I think 8 would be a little bit too much projection on what I think a top 25 should be. I think 8, you could argue, I should say, could be a little bit more projection, depending on how much projection you should put in your polls. But The thing that I'll say is for people who will say Notre Dame shouldn't be eighth because of there's too much projection, then I would say, well, then you can't have Texas ahead of them at all, right? That's just not a thing that you can do. And so there's a lot of aspects that go into it. But I think the coaches poll at 13 yesterday, to me, would be the bottom of where Notre Dame should be in the top 25. Phil Steele had Notre Dame 10th. I think that's a very fair ranking. Lindy's is preseason magazine had Notre Dame 12th. Athlon had them 14th, which I think is a little bit too low. And you look at, I'm going to kind of go through that poll as well, go through some of these and discuss just some of the top 25 rankings that I thought were okay. I understand where you're coming from, but that team should not be there. You look at, as I said, Athlon was 14. And then the one that surprised me, honestly, is Joel Klatt came out with his top 25 yesterday, and he had Notre Dame 18th. And that surprised me because I've always kind of liked Joel Klatt. I still do. I mean, this ranking doesn't change what I think of Joel Klatt. I just think he's wrong. But when I talk about them, when he talked about them, it was really a bit of a head scratcher, to be honest with you. He talked about a wait and see for for Marcus Freeman, which I think is fair. This is what Joel Klatt said yesterday. He said, Notre Dame, I could easily put them higher. I love their offensive line. I think Sam Hartman is going to be better for them. I just question them losing their offensive coordinator, Tommy Rees, and they lose Michael Mayer, who was just a huge part of their offense. Fair on the latter part. With Marcus Freeman, I'll be honest, he is a wait and see for me in terms of whether this is going to work at Notre Dame. Their offensive line is going to keep them in games, and I think that's going to be a hard matchup against Ohio State, similar why Ohio State doesn't get an upgrade against Michigan. If I was Notre Dame, I would line up with that offensive line and go right at Ohio State in that matchup in September. Hartman is a big addition for them at quarterback. So I don't see anything out of line with what Joel Klatt said there. But here's my problem. How are you going to have that and then say this? This is what he has about Oklahoma. Now, keep in mind, Notre Dame went 9-4 last year, beat, let me think, 5 teams, I believe. Let me look at Notre Dame's record real quick. I believe it was 5 teams that Notre Dame beat when they were ranked at the time last season. So Notre Dame beat, I believe, North Carolina was ranked when they played. I believe. Let me just pull up their season from last year. So Notre Dame beat North Carolina at North Carolina. They were not ranked yet. They beat BYU. Okay, so they beat BYU when they were ranked. They beat Syracuse when they were ranked. They beat Clemson when they were ranked, and they beat South Carolina when they were ranked. So I was incorrect on North Carolina. Now, North Carolina eventually jumped in the top 25. They were not ranked when Notre Dame beat them. They eventually climbed up to, because I believe they won like 9 of their first 10 games. They eventually climbed up all the way to number 13 in November before losing their last 4 games of the season and falling out. So Notre Dame won 4 games against top 25 teams last year. And that includes, obviously, as I said, BYU, number 4 Clemson, who they beat by 21. It includes number 16 Syracuse, who they beat by 17. It includes number 19 South Carolina, game that Notre Dame won by a touchdown. And then 2 of their 4 losses were to top 10 teams in Ohio State and USC. Yes, Notre Dame had 2 bad losses. Don't dispute that. But how are you going to look at a team that finished the season with the way that Notre Dame did and say that Marcus Freeman is a big question mark for you, which that part doesn't necessarily bother me. It's that this is what he says about Oklahoma. He says they were 0-5 in one-score games. I think that turns around. When you look at the 2 games they lost by significant margins, their QB, Dylan Gabriel, was not in those games. If he can stay healthy, they should be better. The defense under Brent Venables should be better. They have recruited much better. Everything about this says this is another wait and see, which he says about Notre Dame. They are their biggest competition for Texas. This is a sleeper team for me. All those one-score losses that can easily be turned around, they can easily be a 10-win team and play for the Big Ten championship. Now, I don't necessarily say that I don't necessarily want to say that what he's saying is just nuts. But the point for me is, who were some of those one-score loss games too? He acts like they lost to a bunch of teams that were really good. I could sit there and say, well, Notre Dame led Ohio State for more than Ohio State led Notre Dame. But here's the thing that's kind of where I just don't agree with that line of thinking. So he talks about they lost a bunch of one-score games. They lost by a touchdown to Kansas State. Did any of you guys watch that game last season? Did you watch the Kansas State Oklahoma game? For him to say that they just lost by a score, I think is a little bit disingenuous to me. I mean, they scored with 30 seconds left to make it a 2-point game. I mean, at one point in time in the fourth quarter, Kansas State had a 14-point lead. Oklahoma scored to make it 7, and then Kansas State went back on top. That wasn't really a game that you could look at and say, boy, if a play here, a play there goes different, that they're going to win that game. I just don't buy that. I think when you look at Oklahoma, they got blown out by TCU. They got blown out by Texas. He talks about if Dillon Gabriel would have played, they would have been better. They give up 55 and 49 points. Dillon Gabriel's not the reason they gave up over 100 points in those two games. Talk about losing. They lost to Baylor at home. They lost to West Virginia on the road. They lost to Texas Tech in overtime, and they lost to Florida State. Now, the Florida State game to me is a good loss. That's a good football team. But you lost to a Baylor team last year that had a 6-7 record. You lost to them at home. Let's not act like you were this juggernaut team that almost beat some other really good teams. And the other problem that I have is just sort of the double standard that you have two guys apart. How is Brent Venables any more of a proven coach than Marcus Freeman? You could say he is as a defensive coordinator. But if anything, if you look at the last 2 years, Marcus Freeman has conducted himself in a far more head coach style of manner than Brent Venables, who's constantly stepping on his toe with comments. And I wanted to say something even more harsh in that comment, to sit there and act as if, Notre Dame, who was competitive against Ohio State, competitive against USC with a bunch of starters out, like there's no comment of, hey, Notre Dame lost to USC by 11. They had 2 bad turnovers, but hey, they were missing their best cornerback in Cam Hart. They were missing a nickel who was really good in Tariq Bracy. There's no excuses for that one, right? And they had Dillon Gabriel when they lost to Baylor. They had Dillon Gabriel when they lost to Texas Tech. I'm pretty sure that that's correct. I'm going to pull up his game log here real quick, but I'm pretty sure, yeah. He played against Texas Tech, and they lost. He played against West Virginia, and they lost. He played against Baylor, and they lost. He threw 3 interceptions. So, and then he played against Kansas State, and they lost. So this notion that, they just would have, been much better in those games if they had Dillon Gabriel, to me, doesn't speak anything. And so you look at the head coach experience, and it's the same. You can talk to me all you want about D coordinator experience, but that's irrelevant. It's absolutely relevant about how you're going to do as a head coach. And when you look at how Brent Venables has conducted himself at Oklahoma, you look at how his team last season fell apart. You look at how his team starts to get things turned around. They lose 3 games in a row. And you say, hey, they lost their quarterback. They're 3-3. They bounce back with a nice win over Kansas. Okay, great. They bounce back with a win over a bad Iowa State team. Okay, maybe he's turning the corner. And then they lose 4 or 5. Marcus Freeman, on the other hand, has the really bad loss to Stanford. And then what does Notre Dame do? They come back the next week and they beat UNLV convincingly. They convincingly beat on the road a ranked Syracuse team. They then come back home and blow out a top 5 Clemson team. Then they beat Navy. Then they blow out Boston College. So one team with a first-year head coach finishes the year extremely well. The other team with a first-year head coach utterly implodes down the stretch. Coach is constantly making stupid remarks. And I just don't understand how people say, well, because of whatever reason he was this as a coach or that as a coach, that's irrelevant. It has nothing to do with what you do as a head football coach. And there's zero evidence so far that Brent Venables has done anything to be better than Marcus Freeman. So I think there's what that shows is someone like Joel Klatt, who I respect, who I think is a very knowledgeable football guy. There's still sort of this bias that comes in with certain teams. You're still living on Oklahoma as if they were what they were under Lincoln Riley with Brent Venables, even though there's no evidence that Brent Venables has shown you had a losing record in his first season. I'm going to remind y'all again, lost to Baylor, who had a losing record, lost to West Virginia, who didn't even make a bowl game, lost a Texas Tech team that I actually like. I think Texas Tech is turning things around, but it's still Texas Tech. And then, as we said, lost in a bowl game. I mean, West Virginia last year went 5-7. And a week before, get this, a week before they beat Oklahoma, they lost at Iowa State 31-14. Iowa State finished 4-8 last year. They also 2 weeks before that lost to Texas Tech 48-10. They lost by 18 to Texas, and they got beat by Pitt in the opener. And then a week after beating Oklahoma, they get smacked by Kansas State 48-31. And so this is the team that beat Oklahoma. But I'm supposed to believe that because of something having to do with what he did in a coaching role that has nothing to do with the role that he has now, that all of a sudden I should give him the benefit of the doubt. I just don't see how that makes any sense. And again, I'm looking at this and there's an assumption that Dylan Gabriel is going to be to do for them and answer questions for them, that he's not willing to go full out on Sam Hartman. Now he'll say Sam Hartman's a big addition, but then there's all these reasons why Notre Dame, who won 9 games last year, should be ranked behind Oklahoma, who won 16 games. Again, we can make a case for Texas. Texas, I'm actually okay with them being higher than where he has it. I would not put them ahead of Notre Dame. But I do believe Texas has at least shown enough to say, hey, they're that team that could maybe put it all together this year in a way that I also expect Notre Dame to be able to put together. So I'm actually not as down on the high Texas rankings as other people have done. So, when I look at that, to me, there's just no reason for Notre Dame to be there. And somebody just asked, how would Notre Dame have done with Oklahoma's schedule last year? I have no idea. We don't know what they would have done. We don't know how Notre Dame would have developed early in the season if they would have been able to start the season off with UTEP, Kent State, and Nebraska instead of Ohio State and Marshall. Well, I can tell you this, with UTEP and Kent State at the beginning, Notre Dame's 2-0 to start the season, right? And that's kind of how long it took Notre Dame to kind of get going. So I think Notre Dame would have been better than 9-4, but I can't tell you that. I have no clue. We can't project that. What I do know is that last year, Notre Dame beat 4 teams that were ranked when they played. 4. Oklahoma beat 2. Oklahoma lost 7 games last year, and one of them was to a team that was ranked at the time. Now, that's a little bit of an unfair statement if I don't put context in it, because one of the teams they lost to was TCU. And obviously TCU finished as a really good football team, but they were unranked when they played. Should not necessarily count against them, or shouldn't count against them at all, because TCU ended up being a really good football team. And lost to Kansas State. It was a quality football team. But they lost to everybody good that they played, if we're going to really be honest about it. The only 2 quote-unquote good wins that they had were Kansas and Oklahoma State. That was their 2 best wins. Whereas Notre Dame beat Clemson, North Carolina, BYU, South Carolina, and Syracuse. So I think that's sort of the thing that I'm seeing with a lot of these rankings of Notre Dame that have Notre Dame a little lower, is they're holding Notre Dame to a different standard. And that's really the only time I have an issue with the ranking. It's not so much that I have an issue with Joel Klatt having Notre Dame 18th. It's when I read through his ranking, there's certain double standards that are in play for Notre Dame, it would seem to me, than maybe for other teams. And I think that's an issue that I have. I mean, if you talk about Oklahoma being 0-5 in one-score games, let's not forget that 2 of Notre Dame's 4 losses were also one-score games. And Oklahoma lost a lot of those one-score games with Dylan Gabriel, the quarterback they have coming back. Notre Dame lost those games with Tyler Buckner or Drew Pine. So it's a completely different situation, in my opinion. I think Phil Steele, to me, is from what I have seen, is the most optimistic of Notre Dame. He has them 10th in his ranking. And as you guys will find out when I get to my ranking, that's kind of similar. That's very, very similar to where I have Notre Dame. So I think when we look at the AP Top 25, I'm very curious to see what that's going to be. I think that's a ranking that I don't say I put credence in, because I think all preseason rankings don't really mean a whole lot, but they're interesting discussion points. And where we have to understand is they create narratives. Whether you like it or not, they create narratives. So, for example, when you look at Notre Dame's 2022 schedule, there's merit to an NC State being ranked, for example, if you're talking about narratives. If NC State's not ranked and you go on the road and you beat them, there's not that same perception. I look at Brian Kelly's career, right? And there's this notion that Brian Kelly didn't win big games, and it's a notion built on fact. He didn't win big games. Whether you look at games against top 15 teams when they played, games against top 15 teams, but there's this thing about, well, they only won X number of top 10 games. And I'll point out and I say, well, but one game that we don't have in that is the Michigan State game, 2013. Well, Michigan State was unranked at the time that Notre Dame beat them. They finished 13-1 and ranked, I think, 3rd in the polls. So the narrative of that win doesn't quite carry the same weight as, for example, a year before the Oklahoma game. There's a lot of people that will chalk up that Oklahoma game as the biggest win of Brian Kelly's career. I don't agree. I think he had other bigger wins. I think the Michigan State game a year later was a bigger win. But the perception is that the Oklahoma game was bigger because A, it was on the road, which is fair, and then B, it was a bigger quote unquote program. It's a blue blood, borderline blue blood. I think Oklahoma's a blue blood. And so I think there's that. And then the third factor is Oklahoma was ranked in the top 5, I believe, or they were fifth or eighth. I forget what. Oh, let me go look real quick, see what Notre Dame's ranking was, or Oklahoma's ranking was that year that Notre Dame beat them. I think it was a 5 versus 8 matchup. I just can't remember which team was 5. Notre Dame was 5, Oklahoma was 8. So it was a 5 versus 8 matchup. And when you look at it, you say, hey, that was a big win, no doubt. But to me, that wasn't a bigger win than the game the year later against Michigan State, who finished 13-1, beat Ohio State, and obviously was a team that finished ranked third. But the perception is different. So that's why I do think polls matter in that regard. Polls don't matter from the standpoint of it really does not matter what Notre Dame's preseason ranking is when it comes to where will they be ranked when the college football playoff rankings come out. I don't think polls have any bearing. A lot of people have still kind of get into the notion of they have an impact on the committee. I don't think there's any evidence. I haven't seen any evidence that's true. If anything, we see ESPN losing their minds almost every time we get into these shows because there's some team that I think the biggest one was like BYU a couple years ago. I think it might have been 2020 when BYU was not ranked very high and they lost their minds. And it was just the committee members like they haven't played anybody. And so to me, I think that doesn't impact it, but the narrative of your season is impacted. I think it can impact the where your players are from an attitude standpoint. When you have a win over a team that's ranked a certain place, it can say, hey, look, you are that good. When you beat a team that's maybe unranked, that you and us talking may say, hey, that's a really good football team. Then you look at it and say, hey, they may not realize how big of a win that is. There's all types of reasons why rankings early in the season matter. So I do think it's worthy of discussion, even though at the end of the day, it's not going to have any impact on where Notre Dame is when it comes to the college football playoff. And that's a part of it. So I think what's interesting, however, is when you do look at some of Notre Dame's better teams over the years, you'll find that a lot of those teams did start the season not ranked super high. I've mentioned this before. The 1988 team began the year ranked 13th in the AP poll, quickly climbed up. They were number 5 by the 4th game of the year because they beat number 9 Michigan in the opener, then beat Michigan State and Purdue, and were number 1 by November 5th. What's interesting is Notre Dame still didn't jump up to number 1 after beating Miami. They went to number 2, and they were number 2 the next 2 weeks. And I believe Florida State was number 1. I'd have to go back and look at that. But they climbed up to number 1 for their November 5th game against Rice. And then, of course, held on to that record after beating number 2 USC in the last game of the regular season, and then number 3 West Virginia. Obviously, 1989, Notre Dame was preseason number 2. They stayed in the top 5 all season, never dropped lower than 4th. That was where they were for the bowl game against Colorado. They were 4. Colorado was 1, and then they finished the season number 2 in the AP poll. The next season, Notre Dame came out. They were preseason number 1, finished the year ranked number 6 after losing the Colorado bowl game. The next season, Notre Dame was number 7, so that obviously got into Notre Dame's run of having really good teams. They were preseason number 3 in 1992, and then in 1993, they were preseason number 7. And so that kind of was the beginning of the end for the Lou Holtz era for Notre Dame. And then you fast forward the next time that Notre Dame had some really good teams. You look at Bob Davies' 2000 team that finished in the top 15. That was a team that began the season unranked, jumped quickly up when they beat Nebraska, a Texas A&M in the opener, number 25 A&M. That jumped them to the top 25. Then they had that great overtime loss to Nebraska, which allowed them to jump up to 21. Then they beat number 13 Purdue, and they stayed in the top 25 all season, climbed as high as 10th. They were 10th when they played number 5 Oregon State. But that was the team that began the year unranked. 2 years later, Ty Willingham's first season, Notre Dame begins the season unranked. They beat number 21 Maryland 22-0 in the first game. That jumped them into the top 25. They stayed there all year, climbed as high as number 4, after beating number 11 Florida State on the road. And then, of course, that very next week, they promptly lost to Boston College and finished the season ranked 17th. We look at the 2005 season under Charlie Weiss, a year that Notre Dame finished in the top 10. Again, another year they started the season out of the top 25. They beat number 23 Pitt on the road in the opener, 42-21, then went on the road to beat number 3 Michigan. Then, of course, that jumped them up to number 10. They lost to Michigan State. That dropped them to 16. They climbed all the way back up to 9 after wins at Washington and at Purdue. And then Purdue that year, I didn't realize was ranked when Notre Dame smacked them in West Lafayette. Of course, played number 1 USC down to the wire. Stayed at number 9, climbed all the way up to number 6. They did that twice. They were 6 against Syracuse, fell down to 8, and then climbed back up to 6 when they played Ohio State and finished the season ranked 9th in the coaches poll. So we've seen this several times. Of course, I pointed out in 2012 under Brian Kelly was a year that Notre Dame finished the season began the season unranked. Quickly jumped in the top 25 after a 50-10 beatdown of Navy to start the season in Ireland. A buddy of mine was like, I just felt he had a bad omen about playing Navy in Ireland, and I just pointed out that the last time that Notre Dame played Navy in Ireland, they went 12-0 and played for the national championship. Notre Dame in 2015, that team that was really good, began the season ranked 11th, finished ranked 11th. So that was one of those ones where they weren't as good. 2017, Notre Dame began the season unranked, jumped into number 24, lost to Georgia, spent the next 2 weeks unranked, pounded Boston College, pounded Michigan State. That jumped them into the number 22 spot. So Notre Dame that year was ranked 22nd in the AP poll as late as September 30th, but by November 11th, they were all the way up to number 3 because they beat number 11 USC by 35, beat number 14 NC State by 21, beat Wake Forest, pounded Miami of Ohio, pounded Michigan State, pounded North Carolina, and then, of course, lost to Miami, dropped down to 8, stayed at 8, lost to Stanford. That dropped them down to 14, and they finished the year ranked 11th. The year that Notre Dame was first time Notre Dame made the college football playoff, which is kind of interesting. It's a similar ranking now. Notre Dame finished that year number 5, made the college football playoff. And they started the season ranked 12th, which is very similar to where they are now in the preseason top 25. In the 2020 season, the last time that Notre Dame made the college football playoff, again, they began the season in the top 10, ranked 10th. Stayed in the top 10 all year, climbed up as high as number 2, which they were in the college football playoff, and then the ACC championship, lost to Clemson. That dropped them down to number 4. Losing to Bama dropped them down to number 5. So we have seen Notre Dame have this kind of preseason pedigree before, 10 to 12. They've had good seasons at times. There's other years that they've been ranked this high going into the season or similar in ranking, and the season didn't go as expected. If you remember the 2011 team that finished the season 4-0, ranked 16th in the preseason top 25, and of course they lost to South Florida and were never ranked again until November 19th when they, after beating Maryland, they jumped up to 24. For the BC game, won that game 16-14. The next week they were 22nd, lost to Stanford, and they dropped out and finished out of the top 25. The 2013 season, Notre Dame began the season ranked 14th, went 9-4, and finished 20th. So we have seen this before where Notre Dame started a season well. Obviously, you remember the 2014 season, they started 17th, climbed all the way up to 5th, before their late season collapse that season as well. So we're going to find out which direction Notre Dame goes. As I said earlier, I think the rankings are mostly fair, even though I don't necessarily agree with all of them. I just think some of the standards that some people use to apply to come up to their rankings are just a little bit misguided, in my opinion. But I think that the Joel Klatt one was the one I had probably the biggest issue with. And again, that's someone who I respect a lot. I enjoy listening to Joel Klatt. I've heard people say that there's a bit of a Big 10, Big 12 bias in his ranking, which I think is a fair criticism. Now, whether that's intentional or not, because my whole thing is you sometimes can have a bias that's not intentional. And I don't, Joel Klatt's never struck me as a disingenuous person. I just think sometimes when you cover a team, a conference, you see that team more and more and more and more. So you know their ins and outs. You may see, hey, this is a talented team that maybe didn't live up to expectations. And kind of like how we are with Notre Dame, sometimes we say, look, I understand why the outside world doesn't think as highly of Notre Dame, but I've been around this team. I've been around other Notre Dame teams. This team has the look of something, or, good or bad, whatever the case may be. He is a guy that is around these teams a lot. And I think if there is a bias, I don't believe it's intentional. I just think it's he sees these Big 12 and Big 10 teams a lot, and that can lead to maybe putting a little bit more stock in those leagues than you otherwise would. But I don't view it at all to be something where he's intentionally overhyping Big 10 or Pac-12 team or Big 12 teams because he happens to cover the league. I've never gotten that impression from Joel Klatt. So that's my quick overview of the top 25 and where Notre Dame is. I think the questions that people have of Notre Dame and the reasons that it would be fair to have them a little lower, 10 to 15. Obviously, there's a lot of new faces and some important positions. I've heard people say Notre Dame lost a lot this offseason. I don't think they lost a lot. I think they lost a few important pieces. Obviously, you lost Matt Bayless right before the year. You lost Tommy Rees. You lost Harry Heastand, which was a big one. You replace them with guys, some we know, some we don't. You look at the wide receiver tight end. There's a lot of people that look at that as a reason to be concerned because it's not a proven group. It's fair to say that it's proven. I just think that history has shown that it doesn't really matter if you're proven or not at that position. It's just not a position where there's a requirement for experience the way that it is at other positions. I've pointed this out time and time and time again, even when it comes to Notre Dame. I mean, when you look at Notre Dame's 2014 receiving core, which was pretty good, Will Fuller had 1,000 yards. That was the best year that Corey Robinson had. He had over 500 yards. Chris Brown had over 500 yards. CJ Prosise had over 500 yards. The year before, Chris Brown was your leading returning receiver with 15 catches for 209 yards. That was your leading coming back receiver because you lost TJ Jones at graduation. Troy Nicholas went pro. And then DeVaris Daniels got kicked off the team. So your top two pass catchers were Chris Brown with 15 catches for 209 yards and Ben Koyak with 10 for 171. Will Fuller only had 6 catches the year before. Corey Robinson only had 9. CJ Prosise had 7. So you look at you had 4 receivers that next year that had over 500 yards: Prosise, Robinson, Brown, and Fuller. And obviously Fuller went over 1,000. But if you actually look at their numbers of what they did the year before, it wasn't overly impressive. So if you look at, you've got the 209 for Chris Brown, the 160 for Will Fuller, the 157 for Corey Robinson, and then the 72 for CJ Prosise. You had 598 receiving yards coming back that next season from your lineup of guys of what they've done before. And then, of course, Will Fuller almost doubles that by himself. If you look at this Notre Dame receiving core and what it has coming back from last season, the production is more impactful. So you have 361 yards from Jaden Thomas. You have 192 from Deion Colsey. That gets you to 553 just with them. Then you have 138 from Chris Tyree. You have 62 from Matt Salerno. And you have 41 from Tobias Merriweather. And that's just the receivers. That's 794. Right? What did I say? Like 598 for the other receiving core. So we've seen this before where Notre Dame has had a group that wasn't overly experienced. And then the next year they came out and were pretty productive football players and pretty productive football teams. I think Miles Boykin had 18 career catches coming into his senior year when he broke out in 2018. So it's really going to come down to the experience doesn't matter. It's going to be, is the talent there? And do they have the demeanor and the attitudes that you need to go out there and be impactful? I think another reason is quarterback depth. I think that's a very fair reason to be concerned about the season if something happens to Sam Hartman. And I think Notre Dame fans are probably a little bit more nervous about that than other fan bases just from experience. Obviously, last season, Tyler Buckner goes down. We saw Jack Cohn get hurt against Wisconsin in 2021. We saw Ian Book get knocked out in 2018. He has to miss missed a game against Northwestern, so he had to go on the road, play a ranked team without your starting quarterback. Obviously, we saw Malik Zaire go down with a season-ending injury in 2017. We saw Tommy Rees miss a game as the starting quarterback in 2013. He had to go, missed a game. He got knocked out of a game against USC. You go to Andrew Hendricks, and your offense can do nothing. The year before, Everett Golson gets knocked out of a game. Against Stanford, Tommy Rees has to come in, win you that game, come from behind. No, come from behind, but led you to that touchdown in overtime. Then next game with Everett Golson out, he leads you to a win over BYU. And then, of course, in 2010, Dane Chris gets knocked out against Tulsa for the season, and Tommy Rees has to step into his place. So we've seen a lot of situations where quarterbacks in Notre Dame had to step up, either as starters for a period of time, a game, or have to come off the bench. And even you could even add another game in 2021 because obviously you started Jack Cohn and then he was ineffective. You brought in Tyler Buckner, he gets hurt, and Jack Cohn has to come back in. So you needed two quarterbacks to win that game. Does Notre Dame have two quarterbacks that can win you games this year? It remains to be seen. And I don't know that we have an answer to that. We've got to still see how camp plays out. And I think the defensive line is another area where people have an understandable concern about Notre Dame, and it's a bit of a question mark. And we'll find out if they're able to answer the bell. But I think that's a fair concern for people to have. And I still have some, especially at the big end position. Reasons to be high on Notre Dame. And this is where I don't think enough people are giving Notre Dame credit, to be completely honest with you, is I see a lot of rankings for teams, and what people will point to is, well, you look how well this team finished. This team finished very strong. They won X number of games down the stretch. They did this, they did that. And then you look at Notre Dame and you say, well, why doesn't Notre Dame get that same benefit of the doubt? And you look at the way that Notre Dame finished the season, obviously 6-1, beat three ranked teams that were ranked when they played. Syracuse was ranked, Clemson was ranked, South Carolina was ranked. So in that 6-0 stretch, you go 3-1 against ranked opponents. To me, that should give people say, hey, we saw Marcus Freeman bounce back from bad losses, have similar games later, not lose those games, because Navy game kind of reminded me of the Stanford and Marshall game where you're just not making enough plays to win, but they did that game. They made enough plays to win that game. And then to have your team go into a bowl game, you're missing your two best players, and you're missing actually, you could argue you're missing your two best players on defense, because I still believe Cam Hart was Notre Dame's best corner last year. Will he be this year? Find out. But for the entirety of the season, and he was playing very good football when he went down against BC, and you don't have him against South Carolina. So there's a lot of different aspects of this where you could say that finish should give you reason for optimism coming into 2023. Optimism enough to say that Notre Dame's a playoff team? No, I think that there's other things that have to happen, but optimism enough to say, hey, look, they can go out there and beat really good football teams, go on the road and win football games, right? So they played a bowl game against South Carolina and won, but then they went on the road to beat a good Syracuse team. And part of the reason Syracuse collapsed down the stretch is because of what Notre Dame did to them. Notre Dame just physically beat them up. They played back-to-back really physical games against Clemson and Notre Dame, and they were just beat up. They weren't the same team after that. And the quarterback wasn't right, and a lot of other aspects of it. So I think when I look at it, that's a good one. I think the overall talent of this football team is something that even Notre Dame fans, I think, are sleeping on a little bit. Now, there's a question of, will that talent equal production? Find out. But this is one of the more athletic, talented teams that Notre Dame has had in a very long time, in my opinion. I really believe that. I'm not saying that guarantees equal that production, because I've told you all a million times, potential doesn't equal production. It just means that's your talent level. You got to turn that talent into production. And then, of course, the last reason for me to be optimistic is the presence of Sam Hartman. You're talking about a guy that won 19 games at Wake Forest the last couple of years. He won 11 games and went to the ACC title game in 2021 with a defense that gave up 29 points a game and really not much of a run game to speak of. You think about, boy, if you put him with what Notre Dame has, I think that's a reason that people can be excited. So certainly a lot of reasons to think that Notre Dame can outplay their ranking. Certainly understandable questions as to that you can make you kind of understand, be somewhat sympathetic to where Notre Dame is ranked. They do have a lot to prove this year. There's no doubt about it. Let's move on to topic number 2. So I'm going to put my money where my mouth is, and I'm going to start trying to do this more often. So if you're going to be critical of somebody's ranking or the rankings process, then I think you should be someone that has a ranking process of your own. And so what I've done, and I've been working on this for a little bit, of studying different aspects of the football teams, and I've made some conference predictions so far. I've got a couple other Power Fives I got to work through, but I don't need to work through those to have a top 25, because here's my view of a preseason top 25. A preseason top 25 is a combination of several factors. It's what you did the previous seasons, because I do think trends can matter, or at least to varying degrees. I think another aspect of a preseason top 25 that should factor is what you have coming back. So I've said before, you're the champs until somebody beats you, unless there's some sort of weird circumstance where you lose a ton. And I think LSU 2019 going into 2020 was a perfect example. Lost a ton of players from that team. Lost the offensive play caller, the pass game guy that was so impactful for him. So there's always exceptions to the rule, but that's why you take all these things into account. What you did the past season and then seasons matters. When you look at an aspect of a preseason ranking, what you return, is there a lot of coaching turnover? There's a lot of different aspects of that go into what a preseason top 25 should be. And it's more of it for me. It's more of this is where I think people should start to begin the season with a little bit of projection involved, but it's not a projection for an entire season. I don't think a preseason top 25 should be mostly about what you think teams will be when the season's over. It's the best gauge that I can possibly come up with, and what other people should come up with, of where teams should be now. And that's, to me, what a preseason ranking should be. So, for example, I will say this. Obviously, my preseason top 4 is not going to look a whole lot like my college football playoff prediction. In my preseason ranking, you're going to find that I have 2 teams flipped in my preseason top 25 from where I have them when I predicted my Big Ten conference rankings, for example. Because, again, this preseason top 25 is more about where I think teams should be going into week 0 into week 1 of the college football season. So it's a little bit of a projection, but not as much as if I'm making a conference prediction or I'm making a college football playoff prediction. So I just want to make sure people understand that, because if you see a top 25 and you go back at the end of the year and you're like, you were wrong, you thought so-and-so was going to be a playoff team. Nope, I didn't say that team was going to be a playoff team. I said that team should have been ranked there going into week 1. And I will have at least one team for sure, because I have not figured out all 4 of my playoff teams yet. I've got 3 down right now. I'll only tell you 2 of them because I've already told you them already. I have Notre Dame in the college football playoff, and I have Ohio State in the college football playoff. So those 2 I have in there right now. Notre Dame, I'm going to have not ranked in the top 4 because, again, they don't deserve to be in the top 4 right now. I think they have a chance to earn it by the time the season's over with. But to me, Notre Dame doesn't deserve it. And there's going to be some rankings here that I know you guys are not going to like. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to get to a lot of the takes as I kind of go through this, because I've got to read and talk and all that kind of stuff. But I'll try to get some of the reactions. Obviously, if you have a strong reaction that you want me to see, you put a super chat in there, and I'll definitely see that one. So without further ado, this is going to be my first video edition that I've ever done of my IB Top 25. I've done Top 25s before. I'm going to do this weekly during the season. I don't know if I'm going to do it on video as much. I may do it on CFB Nation, but it's definitely something I'm going to do every week on the Irish Breakdown message board for sure. So I'm going to go 25 to 20. I'm going to go 25 to 1. So I'll start off it's kind of like how the college football playoff rankings do it, and look at it that way. So here is my top 25, starting off number 25. I have the Tulane Green Wave, number 25. I see some people have Tulane higher, and I understand it. You've got Michael Pratt coming back. I think Willie Fritz has done a great job there. I just can't justify having them in there because of how much they lost. I think Tulane Tulane has a chance to be a really good football team again. They could make my ranking look a little bit silly. I think one plus for Tulane is that the conference is not as strong, in my opinion, this year as it was last year. They don't have to beat Cincinnati this year, who I think that probably would have been a little bit easier than it would have been last year. They don't have to beat UCF, who's now gone. They don't have to beat Houston, who is now gone. So those teams have now obviously gone to the Big 12. Now the conference is Tulane is a part of it, but it's Charlotte, East Carolina, Florida Atlantic, Memphis, Navy, North Texas, Rice, SMU, South Florida, Temple, Tulsa, UAB, and UTSA. And as you can tell by my top 25, the 2 best American Athletic Conference teams I have are Tulane and UTSA. The reason I go with UTSA over top of Tulane is, number one, even though I like what some of Tulane has coming back, I like Michael Pratt. I think Frank Harris is a better college quarterback. I understand why people might view Michael Pratt as a better pro prospect. Makes total sense. Better body, big arm, good athlete. There's a lot of reasons to like Michael Pratt as a pro prospect in that regard. Frank Harris is more of a college kid, college player, but I think he's a really good college player. The other part of it too is Tulane lost a lot off their defense. I think they've got like 2 or 3 starters coming back from their defense, which is a big blow for a team like that, and a team that had a lot of really competitive close wins last year. Beat Houston by 3, only beat ECU by 15, beat Memphis by 10. It was a competitive game. Beat Cincinnati by 3, beat USC by a point, beat K-State by a touchdown. That's some really good wins last year. But a team like Tulane, to me, is going to struggle a lot when they lose that many players off their defense. And then the other thing was losing Tyjae Spears is going to hurt a lot. I loved that kid. He ran for 1,581 yards last year, 19 touchdowns, had 256 receiving yards. Heck of a football player, and absolutely went off against USC for 205 yards. He was so good down the stretch. Had 181 against Cincinnati, 199 against UCF. 205 against USC. He went for over 100. He had at least 121 yards in each of his last 8 games. Teams like Tulane are going to have a tougher time replacing that kind of player. And it's also, honestly, it's partly why I had them I initially didn't even have them in my top 25, but I think what they did last year was good enough. And with a really good coach coming back, a proven coach, a really good quarterback coming back, I think they returned 3 to 4 offensive line starters up front, which should help them. So they should be able to be successful, on top of the fact that their schedule is not quite as daunting as it was last year. With UTSA, they return a lot of starters. They have to prove to me something that Tulane has proven, which is that they can go out and beat a Power 5 football team. That is not something UTSA did last season. They obviously lost to Texas. I believe they had a win in 21 over a Power 5 team. Yeah, Illinois, but Illinois was not a very good football team. Where Tulane went out last year and beat 2 really good football teams at the Power 5 level in Kansas State and USC. But I really like what UTSA did last year. I absolutely love Frank Harris as a player. I think he's very talented. They have a lot of kids coming back. They lost one of their receivers, I believe, transferred somewhere, but they have a lot of kids coming back, decent amount of players coming back on defense. And I think their schedule this season is a lot more manageable than your typical AAC team compared to last few seasons. So losing Cincinnati and Houston and UCF has really sapped that conference of a lot of its best teams. So I don't know that you should have as many ranked teams in there. But we're going to find out if I'm right on UTSA early, though, right? And this is the whole point of this is the question mark. Can they beat those Power 5 teams? Because they start the season off with 2 road games in the first 4 weeks against those type of teams. They play at Houston in the opener. They play Texas State and Army next back-to-back, and then they play at Tennessee. So they're either going to solidify themselves as a top 25 team in the opener, or they're immediately going to be out. And they're going to get tested right away. Illinois is the next team that I have. I have them ranked number 23. I talked about this last week when we did our top 25. So when we did our ranking of Illinois last week, I actually had Illinois 3rd in the Big Ten West behind Wisconsin. But the more I thought about it, the more I broke it down, the more I really studied them, when I posted my rankings on the message board, I actually flipped them. And I'm a little higher on Illinois now after really breaking it down. And a lot of it's about their schedule, right? And that's part of this thing too. I didn't mention earlier, schedule should factor into where you have a team. If from a little bit of a projection standpoint, they've got Penn State at home, they get Nebraska at home, they get Wisconsin at home. Their tough road games are at Iowa and at Minnesota. And also they skip Michigan and Ohio State. That's going to help Illinois. And even though they lost some really good players on defense, a really good running back, they have a lot coming back. And so I like what they do. They have very good defensive line, one of the best defensive tackles in college football. And I like what Illinois does. I have them solidly the top 23. You have NC State. Probably should have helped if I would have spelled Wolfpack correctly there. I have NC State 22. I like this NC State team. And I think when you look at them last year, they were a quality football team. They were an 8-5 team. They were ranked late November. As a matter of fact, they were ranked as late as November 12th, and that's when they lost at home to a not a very good BC team, 21-20. They were coming off a very good win over Wake Forest. They beat Florida State last year, had a competitive loss to Clemson, and we're a quality football team. The problem was quarterback. They had some major problems at quarterback. Devin Leary got hurt early, and he wasn't very good when he was playing. MJ Morris stepped in and had some nice games, and then he got banged up and wasn't able to finish the season. So he didn't, for example, he didn't play against Louisville last season in that loss. He got hurt in the BC game, I believe, didn't play very well, didn't play in the bowl game that season either. But they were 2-1 they were 2-0 actually in his first two games as a starter, and he threw 6 touchdowns in those 2 games before he got hurt. Then they brought in Ben Finley. He just wasn't that good, with all due respect. Ben Finley wasn't that good of a player. Put up okay numbers, but just not a guy that's going to make winning plays. And he went 1-2 as a quarterback. Well, now you look at who they're bringing in as their offensive coordinator. They got Robert Anae as their offensive coordinator. You look at what he did at Syracuse, and we talked about this recently, where you took an offense like Syracuse that was terrible throwing the football, and in 1 year he gets it turned around. He did great work at Virginia with a kid named Brendan Armstrong. Well, guess what? He's now back at NC State, got decent weapons to work with, but he's got Brendan Armstrong transferred into quarterback on top of a pretty quality Tony Gibson defense. They had some key losses, but they've got some really good players coming back like Peyton Wilson. So I like NC State. I also think NC State has a schedule that I think of the ACC teams that are sort of were in that contention for this role in the top 25. I looked at Duke, I looked at Louisville, I looked at a lot of the other teams. Those teams just have a little bit tougher schedules. They play Notre Dame early at home, but they get Louisville at home, they get Clemson at home, they get Miami at home, and they get North Carolina at home. Their only really tough road game that, as I see it, as of right now, is at Duke. Their other road games are at Virginia, at Wake Forest, and at Virginia Tech. Games that they certainly should be able to win if Dave Doran does his job. So, I could see them beating UConn in the opener. They play Notre Dame the next week. If they drop that game, which is not a given for Notre Dame, then they play VMI at home, then at Virginia, then home against Louisville, home against Marshall, then at Duke. If they're able to win the games they're supposed to at home and then beat Duke, they're going into October 21st bye week with a 6-1 record and a top 20 ranking. I really like this NC State football team, especially with the addition of Brendan Armstrong. I don't see him putting up the numbers he did at Virginia 2 years ago, but I think their offense is going to be better. And then this next one is a little bit of a projection for me. I'm going to be completely honest with you. Arkansas lost some players. They lost some coaches, but they've got some really talented players coming back. Obviously, Rocket Sanders comes back. He's outstanding. If you have not had a chance to watch Rocket Sanders play, do so. He's a really explosive player. The name is fitting. He averaged 6.5 yards a carry last year, rushed for over 1,400 yards in the SEC. Very, very good football player. And they also get KJ Jefferson back. And if you look at Arkansas last year, he was banged up a lot. He missed 2 full games, completely missed 2 full games. They lost both games, including a 13-10 loss at LSU, where they were at home against LSU, where they were basically down to their last 2 third-string quarterback at that point in time. They went 7-4 with KJ at quarterback. They had a really tough 2-point loss against Texas A&M in a game neutral field they shouldn't have lost, to be honest with you. They had a tough 2-point loss against Liberty. I believe KJ got hurt that game. Did not play well through 2 picks. But when he came back, they won 2 of their last 3, beat Kansas in a bowl game, beat Ole Miss. I just think if KJ Jefferson's healthy with Rocket Sanders, this is a really quality football team. They got some good transfers in. Not a ton, but they returned some really veteran players. They were going into year 3 of Sam Pittman. I just think this is a quality football team that deserves being a top 25. And as long as KJ Jefferson stays healthy, I'm going to continue to advocate for Arkansas being a top 25 team. Now this team 16 through 20, number 20, I have the North Carolina Tar Heels. This is an interesting one because there's a lot of talk about the loss of Phil Longo. And I understand it, and he certainly put up some good numbers. But I've heard some things about that relationship he had with Drake May, and just he had the role he kind of played in that team falling apart last year. I think he went away from the run game way too much. I think that if you look at the defense late in the year at North Carolina, they weren't great by any stretch. They got better. They lost some players that honestly I don't know if those guys necessarily had the right attitudes. I think that they're going to be a little bit better this year. They're a little bit more veteran team. I think they're going to get back to running the football a little bit more. They have a very talented young backfield. Obviously, Drake May's a very good runner. Elijah Green's a good player, but they had two freshmen last year I like a lot, Maureen Hampton and George Petaway. I think getting both of those guys back is big. I think they're going to be a team that's going to be much more physical running the football this season, which is going to take some of that pressure off Drake May. I think their defense is going to be good enough to allow them to go out there and be competitive. And I think when you look at their schedule this year, obviously they've got some tough games. There's no doubt they've got some tough road games in the schedule, but they play at Clemson, at NC State down the stretch, but they should have a chance to win a lot of games early. The South Carolina game is going to be very telling for North Carolina. I like South Carolina. They just missed my top 25. Their schedule's tough, which is partly why. If they can win that game, then they got App State and Minnesota the next 2 weeks, then at Pitt, that'll be a test and a bye week, and then they're at home for almost a month. They got Syracuse at home, Miami at home, Virginia at home, then they're at Georgia Tech, who is going to be better but still has some issues. Then they're home against Campbell and home against Duke before that back-to-back road games against Clemson and NC State. So if they can beat South Carolina in that opener, they've got a chance to be at worst an 8-2 team going into that Clemson and NC State stretch, and that's going to determine whether they can be a 9-3 top 20 caliber team or if they're going to fall out. But I think right now the schedule, having an elite quarterback like Drake May, I think it's a shift in philosophy that's going to allow them to be a little bit more of a balanced football team, are all things that I like about this North Carolina football team going into 2020. Oregon's a team that I'm going to assume I have them lower than a lot of you, and here's the reasons for it. Oregon lost a lot of dudes off their team last year, a lot of dudes. And honestly, I don't think Oregon was all that good last year relative to what their record looked like. I loved what Bo Nix did. I think Bo Nix is a really good football player. I think they caught a little bit of a break against Washington State, beat them. They had a nice win over UCLA, but they didn't have to play USC last year. I think that helped them a lot. They got beat by Oregon State. They got beat by Washington at home. They barely beat Utah. Utah gave that game away, in my opinion. They lost, I think, 4 starting offensive linemen. Now, they're replacing with a bunch of transfers, but that's not a position I like to have a lot of transfers stepping into my lineup, offensive line. They've got some transfers coming in on defense. You're basically banking on this being a team that can go out there and win games. I also think the loss of Kenny Dillingham is going to hurt. The guy that they hired is a good football coach. I think he came from UTSA. Will Stein, I believe he was UTSA the last couple of years. He's a good football coach. But I really liked what Kenny Dillingham did. I wasn't high on Kenny Dillingham early in his career, but he really has won me over the last couple of years. I think he's turned into a pretty good coach. You've got the turnover there. I'm not a big fan of Tosh as a defensive coordinator. I'm just not super high on this Oregon football team. I'm just going to be honest with you. And I don't think they're quite as good, honestly, as people make them out to be. I think top 20 is a fair ranking for them. But I could see them falling out a little bit. I'm just not super high on this football team. And when you have the losses they have on the offensive side of the ball at the big boy position, and you look at some of the ways they won games last year, I just think they're going to have a little tougher time with it than they did. They lost, obviously, as I said, 2 of their last 3, and honestly weren't a couple plays here and there from being 0-4 down the stretch. To be honest with you, the game that's going to tell me honestly if I'm right about them or not is really going to happen in week 2. And that's when they go to Texas Tech. I like Texas Tech. And the only reason I don't have Texas Tech in my top 25, I really wanted to put Texas Tech in my top 25. I loved how they ended the season last year. But they have one of the most brutal schedules in college football. I mean, their schedule is absolutely nuts this year. Not only do they play Oregon early in the season, they play at Wyoming. They play at West Virginia, at Baylor, at BYU, at Texas, at Kansas, then they get UCF, TCU, Kansas State, and Houston at home, and then they get Oregon at home. That is a very, very for that team. That is a really, really tough schedule. But I really like what Joey McGuire's doing there. I do. I think he's doing some nice things. They play defense. For a Big 12 team, they're getting better there. They're not so much the run and shoot that they've been in the past. I like what he's doing there. Their schedule is really tough, and so if Texas Tech can beat Oregon in that first game, then you flip those 2 teams. But, right now Texas Tech has to prove to me they can win that football game. But I like what Texas Tech is doing. And if Oregon can beat them in week 2 at Texas Tech, then I'll be a believer in Oregon and they'll jump up my ranking. I need to see that from them because I was not. I mean, they put up points. They just had better players than everybody they played last year, and I didn't like. I didn't think Dan Lanning impressed me a ton as a coach, as an in-game coach. You know, he'll get better, I guess, but I thought he benefited from a really good offensive coordinator. I think he benefited from having more talent than the teams he played most weeks. And you know, like I said, I'm not a believer. I think the one team they played that had a talent advantage over them, the two teams that they had, the only team really that had a top to bottom talent advantage was Georgia, and they beat them 49-3. I think Washington does not have more talent than Oregon. They just outcoached them. Oregon State does not have more talent than Oregon. They just outcoached them. And I think that's what it boils down to for me. While I'm not a sign on Oregon, we've talked a lot about Iowa. Had that last week. Don't need to rehash that too much. I just think the additions that they had are going to make them a better football team. I love how Iowa finished the season last year. I think they were a really quality team down the stretch, especially when you consider the issues they had at quarterback. You know, they're a team that won 5 of their last 6 games. Their only loss was a touchdown loss to Nebraska, a game they should not have lost. And then they smacked Tennessee 21-0. They beat Wisconsin down the stretch, beat Purdue on the road 24-3 in November. Purdue obviously won the West, beat Minnesota on the road. I really like this football team. And I loved how they bounced back from the Ohio State beatdown. I mean, they were in every game they played outside of that. Even the Michigan game that's 27-14, they battled Michigan. They just had no offense. Lost by 13, lost to Illinois on the road by 3, lost to Iowa State at home by 3, and beat a really good South Dakota State team at home. A really good which was the craziest stat line ever. They won 7-3, didn't score a touchdown. I don't know that I've ever seen that in my life of football. But I really like the talent Iowa has on defense. We've pointed out they just replace players every year. But you give them Cade McNamara, who's a really solid game manager, and you may say, well, that doesn't excite me too much, but that's exactly what Iowa needs. They need a kid that can make some throws. And I liked how Cade played 2 years ago. He was a game manager at Michigan as well, but Ohio State, he made some money throws. He was big time against Michigan State, keeping Michigan in that game. They ended up losing late. I thought he played really good against Penn State. J.J. McCarthy, I get the move, and that's totally fine. I think it was a fair move to make. You're going with the upside play there with J.J. McCarthy, but I really like what Cade does as a game manager. I did not want him at Notre Dame because I think they need more of a playmaker at Notre Dame, but for Iowa, it's a huge upgrade for Iowa. And, of course, we know Phil Parker's a great coach. 17 Oregon State, I was surprised at how many people. I thought when I started looking into doing a ranking, I'm like, I'm going to have Iowa State really high or Oregon State really high. And I thought I was going to have this like really savvy, hey, I'm smarter than everybody else, kind of prediction for Oregon State, with DJ Uiagalelei coming in and all that kind of stuff. And nope, I'm wrong. Everybody kind of has Iowa in or Oregon State in their top 25. So I think the secret's out a little bit on Oregon State. Obviously finished last year 17th, kind of snuck into that spot a little bit last season. And it was kind of weird. They finished 17th, but they went into the bowl games 14th and then dropped 3 spots after beating Florida 30-3. I can't figure out ranking sometimes. But they had a very quiet 10-3 season last year. I think the pickup of DJ Uiagalelei is going to be very good for them. I think that when you look at that system, here's the thing about DJ. I thought he was definitely overrated coming out. He was not a 5-star kid, but when you watch him play, he's a big-armed pocket quarterback. When you look at the game against Notre Dame in 2020, for example, where was DJ making his big throws? He was making big throws down the field. They treated him like a pocket quarterback. And then over the last 2 years, they started doing more and more of the quick spread stuff that required like quick timing. And he's got this really long throwing motion. His game, his skill set, his motion, it's just not built for that offense. And then I think that just shook his confidence a little bit. I don't think he's a big-time player, but I think he's a good quarterback. And this is another team that won last year in spite of their quarterback play. I mean, their quarterback play last season was really bad. And on the season, they had 2594 as yards. They had 16 touchdowns, 13 picks on the season. One of their quarterbacks transferred to Ohio State just to be their third stringer so he could – I assume he's kind of getting into coaching or something. I have no idea why. DJ will help solidify that. They have a really good running back. If you did not watch Damian Martinez last year, again, I'm just trying to help you all out, do so. Didn't play a whole lot early, so they started the season 4-2. He had 5 carries against USC for 14 yards. He didn't have a single 100-yard game until the middle of October. Only had 10 carries against Utah, lost both of those games. Only carries the ball 3 times against Stanford. One of them is a long touchdown run that helps them win that game 28-27. That he becomes kind of the featured back after that. He goes for a buck 11 against Washington State in a win, a buck 78 against Colorado in a win, 107 in a 3-point loss at Washington. That's the only game. They went 7-1 down the stretch, and the only loss was at Washington by 3 points. He had a buck 07 there, 105 against Cal in a blowout win. Didn't play a ton. He had 138 at Arizona State. Then he had 103 in the win over Oregon last season. Kid's a good football player, man. I really like this kid. He's a big, physical, 230-pound back with really nice feet. I love what their offensive line is outstanding. They play really good defense. I love what Jonathan Smith is doing at Oregon State. And if they just had more players in the perimeter, I'd have them higher. I really would. I would rank them higher if they just had a little bit more a little bit more talent up front, to be honest with you. I like that football team quite a bit right now. TCU. I had a tough time with TCU. I initially kind of didn't want to have him in my top 25. I felt like last season was a lot of smoke and mirrors. I do. I thought they were coached really well. I think the world of Sonny Dykes as a football coach. I think one of the biggest mistakes that Cal made was getting rid of him. I thought that was kind of silly. I think he's just a really good football coach. The quarterback that they had, obviously, Max Duggan is gone. The counter to that is like, well, Chandler Morris beat him out in the preseason. He did, partly because Max had some offseason injuries. But Max Duggan was the heart and soul of that team. They lost a bunch of their receivers. They lost their top running back. They lost a lot of guys on defense. And as I said, I just feel like a lot of what they did last year was a little bit of smoke and mirrors. Now, they're still a good football team, but they lose a ton. Their schedule's pretty challenging, and they lost their offensive coordinator. But at the end of the day, this is still Sonny Dykes' football team, and he's an offensive guy. The other part that kind of concerns me about them is their schedule is not easy. They play at Houston, at Iowa State, at Kansas State, at Texas Tech, and at Oklahoma. And then they get Texas at home, BYU at home, Baylor at home, SMU at home, and Colorado at home. So not an easy schedule. I ended up kind of settling in on number 16 for them because you have to figure what happened last year into the conversation. You just have to. And to me, when you look at what they did last year, I do like Sonny Dykes as a coach. I do think Chandler Morris is a quality quarterback. I believe they deserve a spot in the top 25. We're going to find out how long they can hold on to it. Obviously, the first month and a half, they should win a lot of those games. At Houston's really the only game that they might lose if they're a good football team. But even then, I think they should win that football game. We're going to find out who they are more so in the middle of October. So they're Colorado at home, Nicholls State at Houston, SMU at home, West Virginia at home, at Iowa State. I don't think much of Iowa State this year. There's a chance they could be 6-0 right then. But then they play BYU at home, at K-State, bye week, at Texas Tech, home against Texas, home against Baylor, at Oklahoma. So a lot of games that can lose there as well. So we're going to find out what kind of football team that they are late. But I think just what they did last season, and they have enough talent coming back that they deserve to be in that top 25 range. My 15 through 11, you're going to see Kansas State. They're at 15. I thought about having them higher. If they just brought Deuce Vaughn back, I'd feel so much better. They've got, I think, 4 starting offensive linemen back. I love what Chris Kleeman is doing as a football coach. Obviously, hanging on to his offensive coordinator, Colin Klein, will help. Will Howard comes back. He's now entrenched as their starting quarterback. What we're going to find out about Will Howard is, and I still think he's a bit of an unproven commodity, and I'm going to say that because I know he did some good things last year, but it's a whole different situation when you're in the quarterback type of universe that he was in last year, where he didn't start the season as a starter, came off the bench. There wasn't a ton of pressure on him. Came off the bench after Adrian Martinez got hurt. Played well, threw for 296 and 4 touchdowns and a win over Oklahoma State, 48-0. They lose to Texas the next week. Will Howard gets back into the lineup. Doesn't have any huge games. Did throw for 294 against West Virginia, but he manages the offense. He throws 9 touchdowns in the last 4 games. And they won all 4 of them, including beating TCU in the Big Ten 12 title game. But he did that basically as the backup quarterback. went into the season as the backup quarterback. Now it's his team. Now he was the guy this offseason. He's the guy that they're looking for. Can he still do that? I don't know. But I love what this football team does. I love what Chris Kleiman is building. They're going to be 15 for me. I have Utah 14 for a couple reasons. Number one, they did have some key personnel losses. Number two, their schedule is brutal. And then number three, to be honest with you, it's the injury to Cameron Rising. I would have considered having them up ahead of Texas and Tennessee if Cameron Rising wasn't hurt. I think Cameron Rising is an overrated quarterback when we're simply just looking at where he should rank in the national ranking. I see people having him top 5, people having him instead of Sam Hartman. If you just look at him with no context, who is Cameron Rising? He's a solid college quarterback. That's just what he is. He's not a put a team on his shoulders, throw for 4,000 yards kind of guy. He's just a good, solid quarterback. Last year, 3,034 yards, 26 touchdowns, 8 picks, only 7.9 yards per attempt. That's below average, in my opinion. Rushed for 465 yards, 6 touchdowns. I mean, those are Ian Book type of numbers. But here's the context. He fits that system perfectly. He's a gamer. He's gritty. He's a leader. He can make plays when you need him to make plays in a gritty style. I just think they lost a little bit too much talent around him. And the fact that he tore his ACL in the bowl game, it just makes me really question how much he's going to play this year and how healthy will he be. That makes me nervous. And that all honestly made me want to drop them a little bit lower, especially when you look at their schedule. They play Florida in the opener. They play at Baylor. Then they're home against Weber State, then home against UCLA, and then at Oregon State. So they have a brutal first 5 games of the season. We're going to find out who they are. They got some talent coming back, some big boys coming back, but I have question marks. Tight end, they should be okay. It's the quarterback that really is the reason, though, why I have concerns about Utah and why they dropped a couple spots from where I think they should be for a team that's the back-to-back Pac-12 champs. And also a team whose coach I have a ton of respect for. 13, I have the Tennessee Volunteers. This is another team that I have a really challenging time on because when you look at Tennessee and what they have coming back, they lost 2 really good receivers, but they also have some guys coming back that played a lot of football last year at receiver. I thought Brew McCoy was a solid player for them. Can he be a number 1? We're going to find that out. I don't know the answer to that. They have a decent amount of talent coming back on the defensive line. They've got, I think, 3 offensive linemen coming back. They've got talent at running back coming back. And the question really comes down to, I believe Jalen Wright is back. Let me just check that real quick. But I just want to make sure that I'm not misspeaking here. But I believe Jalen Wright, their running back, came back. Give me just 1 second, everybody. I'll have this here in uno momento. All right, SEC. That's Athlon. That magazine is not good this year. Sorry, it just wasn't. Let me get to Tennessee real fast. I should have wrote this down, but I think that Jalen Wright comes back. He is the running back they had last year. And no, did he not come back? Because they have somebody else listed as the starter. Yes, okay. All right. So, yeah, it looks like he is back. So they have 2 really good running backs coming back. I like Jalen Wright a lot. He had 10 touchdowns. Jabari Small was their number 2 back. He's coming back. The receiving core has talent, right? I mean, Brew McCoy is a good football player. Squirrel White had 481 yards as a freshman last year. He was kind of a big play guy for them. Their offensive line returns, I believe, 3 starters. They did lose Darnell Wright, who was a top 15 NFL draft pick last year. Defense returns some good players. Here's where it comes down to for me for Tennessee. Part of the reason I had a tough time with them is because they're ranked where they are for 2 reasons. Number 1 is who they were last year. Again, you have to take that in consideration. You cannot ignore what a team was last season. And what they were last season was an 11-2 football team that smacked Clemson in a bowl game, that beat Pitt on the road, beat Alabama last year, blew out LSU last season. Their losses they had a bad loss at South Carolina, really bad loss. And then they lost at number 1 Georgia. And they had a lot of teams that they just weren't even competitive. I mean, they just blew people out. They blew out Ball State, blew out Akron. Florida game was a 5-point game. It wasn't that close. Florida scored late to make it that way. Blew out Tennessee Martin, blew out Kentucky, blew out Missouri, blew out Vanderbilt, and just really the game against Clemson was closer. Clemson missed like 4 field goals, including a fake field goal that didn't work. that game that would have made it closer, but they didn't, and they controlled the second half of that game. The concern I have is really comes down to Joe Milton. I'm just not a believer in Joe Milton. I thought he made some big time down the field throws against Clemson, but he was even in that game, he was inaccurate. Against Vanderbilt, I think he was like 500 or 50%, I should say, in that game. Completion wise, it was just kind of okay in that game. I think not having some of the big time playmakers that they had last season are going to impact them a little bit. I'm just not a believer in Joe Milton. He got beat out by Hendon Hooker. That's nothing to sniff at. Hendon Hooker's a heck of a quarterback. He's also a guy that got benched at Michigan for Cade McNamara, and he struggled that in that system. Can he run this system over the course of an entire year? Here's what I've heard about Joe Milton. I've heard he's a really good leader. Heard he's a great locker room guy, big time arm, good athlete. I just don't think he has a lot of, to me, arm talent. He has arm strength, but not arm talent. And that's kind of where I'm at with Joe Milton for this season is right there. Is if he is as good as Tennessee fans hope, then they're not only going to be 13, they could be in the top 10. I think their schedule sets up well enough for that. They play Virginia in the opener, Austin Peay, at Florida, UTSA, South Carolina. They get A&M at home. Then they're at Bama, at Kentucky. Then they're home against UConn, at Missouri. They get Georgia at home and Vanderbilt at home. So they could lose to Alabama. If they could split with Alabama and Georgia and then just not get upset by a Kentucky on the road, a Missouri on the road, South Carolina at home, if they can split those two games, now all of a sudden you're talking about Tennessee being a potential playoff team because they don't play it. They don't get LSU this year. They would get LSU in the SEC title game. But, there's a lot to like. There's a lot to like about Tennessee. I just don't believe in their quarterback. That's really what it comes down to. 12 is Texas. This is the biggest projection that I have on this one. Hey, folks, no political talk. All right, please, just can we drop that out of the chat right now? Thank you. Number 12, I have Texas. This is my big projection. I understand why there's reservations about Texas. I need to see Texas prove a lot, but they return a lot of talent. I think that Quinn Ewers going into year 2 is going to be a better player. He's not going to be great, but I think he showed me some things late in the year. I actually thought he played well in the bowl game. I've heard people hammer him for what he did in the bowl game, and I actually thought he played well. Threw for 369 yards. He had the receiver dropped a bomb that hit him right in the hands. At first, would have been another big play. I thought he did some good things in that game. I had some other big moments in the season. I think the injury kind of sapped him a little bit early of experience that he needed, but he comes back and has a great game against Oklahoma. Just is kind of okay the rest of the way. But there's a lot of talent he's throwing to. Xavier Worthy's very talented. They got A.D. Mitchell coming in from Georgia. They got 4 starters coming back on the offensive line, which is going to help. And they got Kyle Flood. You're now going into year 3, I believe, of Kyle Flood, who is very talented. I really like what Kyle Flood brings to the table as an offensive line coach. And I just think their defense is going to be good enough, really, for them to be a top 15 team. Now, am I going to have them as a top 10 team? No, I can't do them as a top 10 team. Honestly, it just comes down to who were their wins last year. Well, they almost beat Bama, but they didn't. They beat K-State on the road. That's it. They lost to TCU. Game wasn't all that close. They lost to Washington. They lost to Oklahoma State. They beat a bad Oklahoma team. They lost to Texas Tech. Like their claim to fame is, they almost beat Alabama. Well, they didn't beat Alabama. They got a lot to prove, but I think the roster's really talented. It is. There's a lot of hype about that roster, and I think it's fair. I think it's a fair ranking to me to have them there. I do. They just have to prove a little bit before I can get them into the top 10. But they are to me a dark horse team that has a chance to do some damage this year. I do think Texas can be that kind of football team this season. Number 11, I have Florida State. Seminoles are a good football team. There's no doubt. I think there's a little bit too much being put on them right now. Hold on one second. My connection keeps dropping. I got to make sure that my wife is not trying to download something right now. So Florida State at 11, a lot of talent coming back. I like the roster. I think they've got talent at receiver. I think getting Keon Coleman to go with Johnny Wilson is huge. They've got a good slot. They're getting the Jaheim Bell at tight end is good. They've got 3 starters coming back on the offensive line. There's talent coming back on defense. Getting Braden Frisk is really big for them. To me, at the defensive tackle, what it really comes down to for me, however, is can Florida State win some of the big games? And they kind of showed us that early with the win over LSU, but then they lost at home to Wake Forest. They lost to NC State. They lost at Clemson. Then they, beat Miami, beat Syracuse, beat Florida, beat Oklahoma. Those are all teams they were supposed to beat. They went on the road and had a quality win over Louisville early in the season. That's good. So to me, Florida State's done a lot of the things that we needed to see them do to start believing the hype that they were going to be good. I mean, we saw them start off 0-4 and 21. Then they had 3 good wins in a row. Then lost to Clemson, lost to NC State, bounced back with a nice finish over Miami and BC before losing to a decent, not very well. Actually, wasn't not a very good Florida team actually, but they jumped up. They did well. They've got a lot of talent. There's a decent recruiting class coming in. They've had some really. They haven't brought in a lot of portal kids, but they've been clutch portal kids. They got Fentrell Cypress, a cornerback from Virginia, who's a good football player. There's a lot to like. I like Jordan Travis. I think he's a gamer. There's just a lot Florida State has to prove to me still. But the other reason, honestly, that I have Florida State a little bit lower is their schedule. And the reason I have them behind Clemson is their schedule. They have to play Clemson at Clemson. Like, look, it just like when Clemson was ascending in the ACC, they couldn't you can't count them as the team to beat until they beat Florida State. Well, they finally did, and they became the team to beat. And so to me this year, when you look at their schedule, they play LSU in the opener. They got to prove to me they can beat LSU again. That's not going to be easy. I think they can, certainly, but they got to prove it. And then 3 weeks later, they play at Clemson. If they can get, here's the deal about Florida State. If they can go 1-1 against LSU and Clemson, especially if they lose to Clemson, if they beat LSU and lose to Clemson, they got a bye week the next week. Then they're home against Virginia Tech, home against Syracuse, home against Duke, at Wake, at Pitt, home against Miami, home against North Alabama, at Florida. They've got a chance to run the table if they can go 1-1 against LSU and Clemson. And to me, that gives them a chance to have a rematch against Clemson in the ACC title game. So the opportunity is there. And Florida State is a dark horse playoff team for me. I really do. I think Mike Norvell has finally gotten rid of some of the cancers that existed on that team. He's brought a more blue-collar attitude. I think, Alex, somebody just said that I think their OC is the best coach on the team. I can't really disagree with that. He's done a great job as their offensive line coach. He did a really nice job coordinating that offense last year. I think their defense got a lot better last season. It's going to be even better this year. I like Florida State a lot. I contemplated having them in my top 10. I think you can make a case that they belong ahead of Notre Dame. The reason I don't have them there is the way that they finished, the way that Notre Dame finished, combined with the way that Notre Dame dominated the ACC last season relative to the way Florida State did. I think that factored into it for me. And then, of course, the projection of Notre Dame starting quarterback is 3-0 against Florida State and 2-0 against Jordan Travis. And he beat Florida State last year at Florida State with Wake Forest roster. To me, that's why I have them below Notre Dame. But they could easily sneak in to be a higher-ranked football team for me this season. I like where Florida State is trending. I just need to see one more jump from them before I can put them into the top 10, in my opinion. Here's my top 10. Now, here comes your Notre Dame Fighting Irish. I do have Notre Dame 10th. I've talked about reasons why. I think, obviously, the way Notre Dame finished the season last year, 6-1 down the stretch, half of those wins over ranked opponents. I think Marcus Freeman made some good hires this offseason. If you take away the process and just look at the end result, the hires were very strong, in my opinion. We're going to have a lot to learn about Jared Parker. He's kind of the one question that we have because we just don't know a lot of who he is and what he can do. But you look at the defense returns. I think I had something like the team returns over 300 career starts, and the defense has a lot more of them. There's a lot of kids that have played a lot of football on this Notre Dame defense. Being in year 2 of the Al Golden defense also helps them. I think that's important as well. And I think that those are all factors that are going to play in. Of course, Notre Dame's schedule, 2 of the 3 best teams you play are at home. I think that factors into it as well, into their schedule. So I think those are things those are things that factor in why Notre Dame is a top 10 team for me. I have LSU at number 9. LSU is a very intriguing team. Yes, they won the SEC West. I think they're getting a top 5 bumps because of the fact they beat Alabama. And I think that doesn't take away from the season LSU had. I think LSU had a very good first season under Brian Kelly. 10-win season, it's nothing to sniff at. But the reality is other than Alabama, they lost to every other good team they played, basically. They lost to Florida State in a game that they had a chance to win late, but Florida State also had a chance to put that game away. It was 24-17, and Florida State's getting ready to go in and score to make it 31-17, game over, and they fumble inside the 5-yard line, and then LSU went down and scored, missed a PAT to tie the game. So to me, LSU goes out and gets blown out by Tennessee, barely beats Auburn, okay win against Florida. If KJ Jefferson plays against Arkansas, they lose. They get blown out by a bad Texas A&M team. They get blown out by Georgia. Their claim to fame is beating Alabama, and that was a great win. I mean, great win. It wasn't a fluky win. It was a hard-fought game, and I thought that was a good win. Somebody just said they did crush Ole Miss. Have you noticed who's not in my top 25? Ole Miss. I don't think Ole Miss is that good. I really don't. I know that they were ranked high, but Ole Miss is a team that lost 5 of their last 6 games, and a lot of them weren't close. I don't think, and their only win down the stretch was a 3-point win over Texas A&M. Here's who Ole Miss beat last year: Troy, Central Arkansas, Georgia, Tulsa, Kentucky by 3, Vanderbilt, Auburn, and Texas A&M. That's it. Ole Miss isn't a top 25 team for me. And so that win doesn't mean a whole lot for me. That's no different than Notre Dame blowing out Syracuse, to be honest with you. I love their quarterback. I think they've got a really good skill talent. Getting Logan Diggs to transfer in was really important for them. I think he's a really good football player. Offensive line, you got 3 to 4 starters coming back. They got a lot of talent coming back on defense. Year 2 of the system under Matt House is going to help them. You obviously have a very talented player coming back in Harold Perkins. This is a quality football team. They just have to prove to me that they can consistently win the big games. And I don't think that LSU has proven that. And when you look at their schedule this year, it's not going to be easy. They got to play Florida State in Florida. You talked about, they got to play at Mississippi State and at Ole Miss. They play Arkansas at home, get Auburn at home, Army at home. Then they finish the season with at Bama, Florida at home, Georgia State at home, and Texas. I'll say this: if they can get out of the Bama game with 1 to 2 losses, then they're going to be. That's how they prove it, right? I mean, I'll say this: like, LSU fans may not want to hear this, but if Brian Kelly goes 10-2 against a record that has Florida State on a neutral field in Florida, Grambling at Mississippi State, Arkansas at home, at Ole Miss, at Missouri, who I think is going to be a much improved team this year, by the way. They return a lot. They were borderline top 30, 35 for me. Auburn at home, who I do think has talent. Army at home, which is not an easy game. Bye week at Bama, Florida, Georgia State, and then A&M at home. If Brian Kelly goes 10-2 or better against that schedule, he is a heck of a football player. Or a heck of a football coach with a heck of a year. And some of the questions I have about can he win at Notre Dame get answered. I mean, Notre Dame, LSU get answered. So to me, that would be a really good season, 10-2. And if they're better than 10-2 and they are a legit top 5 team, then he should be up for Coach of the Year because, again, their roster, it's not anywhere close to what it was in 19. They have a very good roster, but it's not an elite roster, in my opinion. I think they're getting pumped up because they beat Bama. If he does better than I think he's going to do, because I could actually see them, like if I were to say, okay, this is your preseason ranking. Do you think this team is going to finish higher or lower than where you have them? I actually have LSU ranked lower. I project them to go lower than what they would have coming in. So that's my thoughts on LSU. But if they're better, then that's a heck of a coaching job by Brian Kelly at this season. Number 8 is Clemson. I know some of you are going to have a problem with this. I understand it. But this is, to me, where Clemson deserves to be. The whole Notre Dame beat them thing is good. It's partly why Notre Dame is 10. But head-to-head is not the end-all, be-all for me when you look at top 25s. when you look at where teams should be ranked. It's about the entirety of your football team and what you have coming back. When I look at Clemson, yes, the Notre Dame game was a blowout, but that to me was an anomaly. It was just Notre Dame's night, and that tends to happen. We see that from time to time. It's like why I have LSU ahead of Tennessee. Tennessee whooped LSU's butt, but when you look at what they got coming back, they've got better talent coming back to me overall, better quarterback situation. I think Clemson's going to be better quarterback this year with Cade Klubnik. He got very valuable experience last year down the stretch. I love the Garrett Riley hire. The offensive line for Clemson. This could be one of the best offensive lines they've had in a long time. It's a big physical line. They were pretty young last year at spots. They got a lot of those guys coming back. I think Cade fits that offense so much better. Will Shipley's a good football player. There's decent talent behind him. The question on offense is similar to Notre Dame's. There's talent at receiver. It's young. Can it step up and play at a high level? If it can, then this offense could be really, really good. I think when defensively, they lost some big-time players on the D-line. They still have Tyler Davis coming back. Rook Row comes back still. Justin Maskell's a quality big end. Xavier Thomas is back. If he can stay healthy, is going to be a good football player for them. They've got a very good linebacking core coming back. I think Jeremiah Trotter individually is a little overrated as a preseason first, second-team All-American, but he's still a really good college linebacker. Barrett Carter's a really good college linebacker that now going into year two as a starter has a chance to be really good. Their corners are better. I don't think they're as good as people make them out to be. They're better. They have a lot of experience at safety. I just like this football team. And here's the other part too. I talk about schedule being a part of what goes into where a ranking is. And the fact of the matter is the two biggest games that they play, actually, you could argue three. So right now, looking at their schedule, they play four teams that are in my top 25. Florida State, Notre Dame, NC State, and North Carolina. Three of those four games are at home for Clemson. So that factors into it as well. Do I think Notre Dame can finish ahead of Clemson? Yes. But you look at the entirety of the criteria that goes into it, I think Clemson deserves to be ranked ahead of Notre Dame right now. I won't be surprised if Notre Dame finishes ahead of them at all, but right now they belong there. 7 is USC. USC is an interesting team. You've got the best player in college football coming back. It's not debatable for me. Caleb Williams is a stud. You upgraded your talent level on defense. I don't think that necessarily means you're going to be good on defense. Will they be better? It's hard to be worse. If we're going to be honest, it's hard to be worse. And so I look at their defense and I say they might be able to make a couple more extra stops here this year. We'll see. Kalen Bullock comes back. He's a pretty good player. The big linebacker, Gentry, comes back. They got a couple transfers coming in. We'll see if those guys are, team guys or if they're just looking for payouts. We'll find out for sure on that one. And to me also, I look at it and I say, it's the offense side of the ball, which is why I'm not quite as high on them as some other people and why I think this ranking could end up being lower is I don't love their receiving core. I don't think it's as good as it was last year. It's still very good. I should say this. I don't love it relative to the expectations. I think that's a much better way of saying it. Saying I don't love it is an unfair statement. It's a very good receiving core. I just don't think it's as good as people make it out to be. Taj Washington's a good player. Mario Williams is a good player. Brendan Rice is a good player. Dorian Singer's a good player. None of those guys are elite guys. As a unit, it's pretty good. Marshawn Latimer, to me, is not a huge upgrade over what they had last year. Dye was a very, very good running back before he got hurt. I like Austin Jones, good football player. The big concern for me is the offensive line. The offensive line for USC last year was very steady. It was a little overrated, but it was exactly what they needed. It was a steady group. You're going to need 3 transfers most likely to be starting for you on the offensive line. If not, you might have 4 guys in new spots. I'm just not in love with the offensive line this year. I like Jonah Monheim. He's a nice football player. Their center's a nice football player. Brett Nealon. I'm just not in love with the transfers in. And I think it's like I've said this with other teams. When you're Oregon, when you're completely relying on basically a new look offensive line with a bunch of transfers, that's a position more than any other that you just need repeats. And they are going to have to prove to me that group can play. But I think with Caleb Williams and Lincoln Riley's talent, and I think you could have a situation where, where they could be a really good team again this year. But the other reason why I'm just not if I had to bet, I would bet on USC being a little lower than where they are now. And we've talked about this on past shows. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. Their schedule starts off pretty easy. San Jose State, Nevada, Stanford at home. You've got a bye week. Then you're at Arizona State. I have Arizona State in the bottom 4 teams in that division. I have Colorado in the bottom 4 teams in that division. Then they're Arizona at home. You're talking about USC should be 6-0. But this is how they finish: at Notre Dame, home against Utah, at Cal, who brings a lot of guys back, even though I don't think they're going to be that good. Washington at home, at Oregon, home against UCLA. That's going to be the make or break stretch for USC. Right now, they belong where they're at, in my opinion, but I could see them dropping a little bit. But Caleb Williams is also good enough, and Lincoln Riley is good enough where you could argue that they need to be ahead of Penn State. I think that's very fair. I just think Penn State at number 6. I've always been on the Penn State's overrated bandwagon, and I've always believed it to be true. I do not believe that they were a top. To me, they were not a. I had them 11-2 last year. Great win over Utah. Yes, Cameron Rising got hurt, but they were controlling that game before Cameron Rising got hurt. That was a good win. That was sort of that win that said, okay, maybe this Penn State team's a little bit different. But here's where it comes down to for me. Penn State is historically overrated, especially under James Franklin. However, I think this team has a chance to be pretty good. Somebody just said I love Drew Aller. I do, but that's not the reason why. I don't think they're going to be relying on Drew Aller to go out there and win them 12, 13 football games. I think their offensive line started to figure some things out last year. It took Phil Troutwine a little longer than I thought it would take him to get that offensive line going, but they've got talent there. Olu Fashanu is one of the best tackles in college football. The kid that they have at right guard, Salim Wormley, is a kid that I loved coming out of high school. They've got Wallace coming back, very veteran offensive line. They got a transfer in from Kent State, Dante Cephas, who Notre Dame tried to get to look at them. He wasn't interested in. He's a PA kid, goes to Penn State, great pickup. Lambert's coming back. They've got good tight end play coming back this season, and they have one of the best running back combinations in college football. And they were both freshmen last year. That's the other part of it is when you look at the running game for last season, Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen combined for 1,928 yards, if I'm doing the math in my head correctly, 1,061 for Singleton, 867 for Allen, 22 touchdowns, and they were both true freshmen. They're going to be outstanding this season. They've had back-to-back really good recruiting classes. They played a lot of young guys last year. Their best linebacker to me last year, Abdul Carter, it was a true freshman. He's outstanding. Kobe King, I believe, was a redshirt freshman last year. They bring back Kalen King, who's one of the better cornerbacks in the country. Defensive end, they've got good defensive ends. If they can figure out and they've got players there, but if they can get guys to step up a defensive tackle, this Penn State team has a chance to be really good this season. Their schedule is also favorable. I think it's a very manageable schedule as Penn State often puts together. It's not a real challenging schedule. They play West Virginia in the opener. They then are Delaware at home. The next 2 weeks are, to me, going to go a long way towards defining their season. At Illinois, home against Iowa. If they're 1-1 in those games, then they're okay. If they go 2-0 in those games, they're going to be a team to watch out for. They have a bye week after they play at Northwestern. Then they play UMass, at Ohio State. I have as a loss. Then Indiana at home, at Maryland, Michigan at home. I have them beating Michigan, which is why I have Penn State ahead of Notre Dame or ahead of Michigan in my predictions for the conference. Preseason, though, they don't deserve to be ahead of Michigan. Then Rutgers and then at Michigan State. So I think Penn State's got as a dark horse. I've said this before. They're a dark horse playoff team out of the Big Ten. I don't think they're going to do it. I think Ohio State's going to be that team, but they have a chance to be really good. I love the talent level that they've accrued the last couple years. A lot of very talented young players. Their defense is going to be better. Year 2 under Manny Diaz. I'm not a big fan of Manny Diaz, but I've been very consistent about this. Even if you're not a good coordinator, in year 2, if you return a lot, your defense is most likely going to be better because those kids know whatever it is you're doing even better. And so I like what they bring back. Ends are back. Linebackers are back. One of the best corners. Their safeties have some athleticism. They're always athletic. And they're going to be good enough to me to overcome what tends to be, James Franklin not being the greatest in-game coach. But he's a good motivator and a heck of a recruiter. And this is going to be arguably his most talented team top to bottom. I really believe that with Penn State. And we're going to see if they're able to prove that to be true. This is my top 5. I think Washington at number 5 is gonna probably shock a lot of you and get a lot of you to disagree with me on that. Totally fair. I'm projecting a little bit here, but I think Washington was one of the most underrated teams in college football last year. I really do. They return a ton. If Ohio State has the best receiving core in the country, they do. I think Washington's is number 2. Michael Penix is the key. They gotta keep him healthy. But when you look at that football team last year, they were the quietest 11-2 football team I've ever seen. They did not get nearly the attention and love that they deserve. And the funny thing is, the 2 teams they lost to were both teams they flat out should have beat. They smacked Michigan State, smacked Stanford, then they lost at UCLA by 8. Then they lost at Arizona State by 7. I just still don't know how they lost that game. Bounce back with a win over Arizona, bounce back with a win over Cal, bye week, beat Oregon State at home, went on the road, beat Oregon, beat Colorado at home, beat Washington State on the road, a good Washington State team, and then beat Texas in a bowl game. I think their defense is going to be their question mark, but it's still better than it was last year. They returned some good players. Obviously, Braylon Trice is an outstanding player. They got a couple good transfers in. Offensively, it's where it's at, though. The only red flag I have is they did lose a couple pretty good offensive linemen. They got a transfer in, I think, from an FCS school. It's a good football player. He's good. I think their running game is going to be better. They got a couple transfers in. They got a kid from Mississippi State, Robinson, this is a good football player. They also got Ngata from Arizona State. So I think they're going to have a quality run game this year. Great receiving core and a big-time back, and I'm a big Kalen DeBoer fan. He is an excellent football coach. And then you look at their schedule this season in 23. They get Boise at home, at Michigan State, Tulsa at home, Cal at home, at Arizona. They get Oregon at home, Arizona State at home, at Stanford. They're at USC is the big one. Home against Utah, at Oregon State, home against Washington State. The most disappointing thing of what happened recently with the Pac-12 is I have said this entire offseason. The Pac-12 is the deepest conference in college football when it comes to the number of teams that can win that conference. Not deep they got a bunch of championship contenders and all that, just from the ability to win that division. And the back half of that schedule is absolutely jam-packed. We talked about USC earlier. Washington's second half of the schedule is also challenging, but they do get Washington State at home. They do get Utah at home. They get Oregon at home. So I really like what Washington does here. I think being 11-2, beating Texas, beating Oregon, I like them at number 5. I think you could make a case to have a couple other teams ahead of them. I think you could make a case if you want to go back to you can make a case to have USC ahead of them. That's very fair. You can make a case to have Penn State ahead of them. That's fair. I mean, you can make a case to have Clemson ahead of them, although I wouldn't be overly sympathetic to that. You can make a case for LSU. I like Washington here. I think they've done a really nice job. I like what their coach is doing. Ohio State at number 4. Again, you're talking about a team that went 11-2 last year, beat Notre Dame, beat Penn State, lost to Michigan, bad loss, and then took Georgia down to the wire. Outside of one bad day against Michigan, Ohio State was still a really good football team last year, an outstanding football team last year. They got to figure out that Michigan thing. And I've predicted Ohio State to win the Big Ten for those who didn't watch that show. As I said before, my preseason top 25 is not a prediction of what will happen. It's where I think teams should be ranked going into week 1. And Michigan is the defending Big Ten champs back-to-back. They've been in the playoff the last 2 years. They have beaten Ohio State the last 2 years. They deserve to be ranked higher, even though I don't think it's going to finish that way. I struggle with where to put Alabama because I have major question marks about their quarterback position, but I love their defense. But here's the thing about Alabama. I really think Alabama is going to be a much better running team this year. And that's partly why Tom Reese got hired. They have a massive offensive line. I mean, it is massive. They're going to be huge up front. They've got a very talented backfield. They've got some good returners coming back, but their freshman class is outstanding. I was not real high on the kid they got from Georgia early on, but I loved his senior year film. Obviously, Richard Young is a part of what they're doing. Jason McClellan's a good back. There's a lot of talent at running back. I think they're going to be this is going to look a lot more like a pre-Tua Alabama team, in my opinion. And that's why I have them kind of coming up, because that's going to make their defense better. Because I think Alabama's got a chance to be really good on defense this year, even with Kevin Steele as their D coordinator, who I'm not a fan of, but there's just a lot of talent to work with there. If they can be a better ball control team running the football, I've listened to some press conferences and listened to some reports from Bama people saying they're seeing a lot more 12 personnel and practice and stuff. Y'all know Tommy Rees is going to want to run the football. And if he sticks to that and they go back to maybe a little bit pre-Tua offense like I'm predicting they will, I think Bama's going to be really good this year. Michigan at number 2, I talked about. And then, of course, Georgia number 1. Yes, they lost players, but they have a ton coming back. They're going to be a very talented football team. And it really comes down to this. I have a lot of concerns about whether or not Georgia is going to finish here. Obviously, for number 1, it's incredibly hard to win 3 in a row. I think Todd Monken being gone is one of the most untalked about big stories that I have seen in college football. Mike Bobo is not someone I'm a big believer in, to be completely honest with you. I don't think he's a very good offensive coordinator. I don't think he's a great offensive mind. I do like Carson Beck at quarterback. Their team is very talented, but it comes down to this, guys and gals. I'm a big fan of when it comes to rankings like this, you're the champ until somebody beats you. And Georgia's 29-1 the last 2 years. And the only team that beat them was in the SEC title game 2 years ago. And Bama and Georgia got their rematch in the title game and won the championship. So I can't discount Georgia being number 1. I can't. And so that's why I have them number 1. So that is my top 25 for the season, the first official Irish Breakdown top 25. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Took a little bit longer to kind of go through than I anticipated, but just wanted to kind of give you guys some juice and some meat as to why I have those teams ranked where I have them. This last section is going to be a little bit quicker than I anticipated. I was going to bring up some film and say those type of things and go into that, but I'm just going to be kind of brief with this one. And it comes down to this is I think there's a lot of the angst on the recruiting for the 2024 class, especially on the defensive side of the ball, is understandable. I do. If you're not someone that watches a lot of film, if you're not someone who's a former coach or an analyst, and you're just someone who, hey, look, all I can go by, I'm not a film breakdown person. I go by offers and I go by rankings. I get that. Totally fair. I would say this. The angst that some have, while fair, is really I'm trying to think of the way to say this. It's if you talk to people around the program, they obviously don't feel that way, and it's an understandable way because they didn't, like in the past, Notre Dame would get guys and we'd hear the spin. Oh, no, we really like that guy all along, and we know that we tried to recruit this other guy for 6 months and lost him, but ultimately we think this guy's going to be a better player. Bull. It's like every kid that Notre Dame would recruit for 8 months and then miss, he had bad grades. Oh, you guys just now figure that out? Come on. There's always excuses. When you look at this staff and the guys that they landed, the premise of the discussion here is they're betting on their ability to evaluate players. And we're going to find out if this staff is good at evaluating players based on this class more than any other. Because some of the guys they got last year, there was good evaluations there, but they were just big-time players. It didn't take great evaluation to see that Jeremiah Love was really good, or Jaden Greathouse was really good, or Braylon James, or Rico Flores, or Cooper Flanagan, or Charles Jagasaw, or Sullivan Absher. You didn't need a rocket scientist to realize that Drake Bowen and Jaden Osbury were dudes at linebacker. You didn't need to be the world's greatest cornerback evaluator to look at Christian Gray and say that guy's really good, or Micah Bell and some of those guys. And so you saw some evaluations. They liked Ben Minnick and obviously Don Schuler and Preston Zinner. There's always those type of guys. Every team has those. But with the 24 class, they've kind of taken it to a different level with that. And I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I tend to agree with them on some of these guys, not all of them. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But when you look at guys that they've landed, Cole Mullins, Logan Thomas, Leonard Moore, Kennedy Urlacher, Bodie Cahoon, Teddy Rizak, Sean Sevillano, even at receiver, Logan Saldate is that type of kid, but that was a little different because they had to go find him after they lost a commitment. Getting Keidron Young, some of those types of guys. But especially on defense, this staff is banking on their ability to evaluate players. And when you look at it, they've made these decisions of hey, we like this guy better. Ryan talked about this a little bit yesterday. He talked about Malachi Williams, and he and I are incredibly high on Malachi Williams. I think Ryan likes him better than Elijah Rushing. I think I could be wrong on that, but I think he does. I have said that Malachi Williams has the highest upside of any defensive end on the board, and I still believe that to be true. It's a great pickup for Penn State. But when you look at Notre Dame, they thought Cole Mullins and Logan Thomas were better, or at least equal to where they were comfortable taking them. Cole Mullins is not a name we talked about a ton because we didn't think they had a shot at him. We had a hard time getting in touch with them, still can't get in touch with them to interview him for stories and such. But he was a kid that we were very high on film-wise. We talked about him briefly a couple times earlier in the process about how much I liked this film. Just didn't think Notre Dame had a shot at him. Then they ended up getting him. And it's a big pickup. Logan Thomas is a freaky talented kid, just needs to learn how to play the game a little bit more. Bryce Young, we've talked about. Very talented player. Low floor, high ceiling guy. Bodie Cahoon, 6'3", 220, 4.5 speed. Teddy Rizak's got 4.5 speed. Y'all know I love Leonard Moore as a player. And I think Kennedy Urlacher is a kid with a high ceiling. But the reality is right or wrong, this isn't an analysis of what they're doing. It's a statement of fact. They took a lot of kids that they are betting on they are right about that a lot of other people are wrong about. And it's not because they missed on other players. It's not because they were struggling to find players at those positions. You could say, well, they missed on A, B, C, D, E, and F at safety, and you'd be correct. But if you go back to the very beginning of the safety process, Kennedy Urlacher jumped on the board early as a kid they liked, and they pushed for him hard, even when we thought they had a better shot at Jalen McClain, when we thought Davis Andrews was going to be in the 24 class, who I love, by the way, when we thought they had a better shot at DeJuan Lane and some of those different players, that was a kid who they liked. Whatever my feelings may be, your feelings may be, is anybody else's feelings, you can't deny that the staff liked him a lot. When you look at Bodie Cahoon, when Notre Dame started to make him a priority, it was back in like March when there was a lot of really good linebackers still on the board. But they said, we love this kid's potential. He hasn't played linebacker much. We see a 6'3" kid that's 220 pounds that can run a legit 4.5. He's got really impressive athleticism. And what I would encourage you to do, if you don't think he looks athletic on the football field, because, and I think that could be a fair takeaway, because again, he isn't a natural linebacker. Go watch his sophomore film when he's playing safety, and you'll see a much more athletic kid. And if you can, and there's some online, if you can find some of his lacrosse film, then you're really going to see a kid that's athletic, because was originally his number one sport. If you remember, he was committed to Ohio State to play lacrosse. But they're banking on that. Teddy Rizak was a kid I'd never heard of until they went to his high school and were able to kind of see a workout, got some testing numbers, got a verified I think I've heard between 4.52 and 4.55. And so, to me, I when you look at him, he's a guy that the staff did not reach on, did not panic on. They took him early. It was, we found this kid, we're going to take him before anybody else gets involved. That's a gamble that they took. There's no doubt it's a gamble, but it wasn't one based on a panic move. They just loved the kid. And so when you look at this, Leonard Moore, they took him, didn't he commit like back in March? It wasn't a situation where, we're struggling to find corners that we like. They'd recruited cornerback very well under Mike Mickens. It was just they loved the kid and they wanted to get on him before a lot of the other big schools got on him. So what we're finding with the defense especially, but even true of Anthony Knapp on the offensive line and Styles Prescott to a degree on the offensive line, and so Logan Saldate and Kedron Young, who Notre Dame liked over some much higher ranked players at that position, is this staff is betting on their ability to evaluate players. And if you look at some of the things they like, what are some of the themes that we've seen from these players on defense? Long. Now, there's some guys that they've got that they're evaluating on that I'm not as high on. Sean Silviano's one, for example. I don't see what they see. I hope they're right. I'm just being honest. I don't see what they see. But you can't say that Silviano was a panic move, because they basically forced Owen Wafel out of the class to take Sevillano. That's just a reality of it. They may be right. They may be wrong. We'll find out. But it wasn't a panic move. It was an evaluation move. And I think that's the difference between some of the guys that they're taking that are considered, projects compared to what we saw in the past, where in the past, when they would take those kids, it was sort of like it's a panic move because they missed out on guys. Not always. Adi Takumbo Ogundiji was not a panic move. He was part of a great defensive line class. They had 3 other ends in that class. So there were some guys like that, but Johnny Williams, Grant Blankenship, guys that they took back in the 14 class and moving on, where they were missing on guys. They had to take, Jonathan McCollum. They'd missed on a bunch of ends. They had to take him. He wasn't that great of a football player. I think he was like the lowest ranked kid in my class. Now I'm looking at these classes. I'm like, I can't believe I have Ben Minnick as the lowest ranked defensive player in that class. It's like I'm struggling with that because he's a good football player. I'm looking at this class and I'm saying, man, there's a lot of talent here. There really is. And they're basically banking on their evaluation. And what are they looking for? Length. Cole Mullins has great length. Bryce Young and Logan Thomas have crazy length. Teddy Rizak in exceptional length, 6'4", 6'3.5". I was told I got to go back and remember. I remember what the arm, I can't remember. I don't want to say it because I don't remember it specifically, the specific number. But I remember when they said to me, hey, this is his length. And I'm like, wow, that's crazy long. Bodie Cahoon's very long. Kingston is a guy that's not long, but he's more of a higher floor guy. Leonard Moore, 6'2", crazy long arms. Bronte Johnson, crazy long arms. Kennedy Urlacher's pretty long for his size as well. He's not tall, but he's pretty long athlete. And so when you look at Notre Dame and you say, hey, that this is where they're at, you have to admit that whether you agree with it or not, and again, this is not a defense of the staff. This is not a criticism of the staff. This is an observation of what we're saying. And a saying, we're going to learn if they're right or wrong. If they're right, this is going to be a lot of fun to watch. And it's going to make me feel better about this team's ability to go out and get elite college players. Because, again, I don't care if you're an elite recruit. I care that you're an elite player. Notre Dame has 2 players that Pro Football Focus ranked as top 30 players in the entire country. Preseason first or second team All-Americans in Joe Walt and Benjamin Morrison. Joe Walt was a 3-star recruit. I think he jumped into the top 400 late in the process. Benjamin Morrison was ranked in the top 300 by 0 national people. I think I'm the only person that had him as a top 100 player. I don't know anybody else from a ranking standpoint had him anywhere close to where I had him. But he's turned out to be an elite college player. So it matters that you're elite. I don't care how you get there. There's no doubt that Notre Dame has to land more elite talent. No question. If they want to win a national championship, they have to land elite ends. They have to land elite corners and elite linebackers and receivers and running backs and offensive linemen. The only point is that I've said to you all is we all should agree on that. The talent level has been really good at Notre Dame in recent years. Not good enough to beat Georgia and Bama with any consistency. Maybe you catch some breaks on a given Saturday. But to consistently go out there and be that team, they have not gotten there yet. And this current team would not be there if it's not for the transfer portal, right? If Sam Hartman's not on this football team, I don't have Notre Dame 10th. And I don't have them as a playoff team. I don't. Because there'd be too many questions about Tyler Buckner's health and projection, and I love his talent, but he just hasn't panned out yet because of all the injuries. So they've had to rely on the portal. Thomas Harper, Javante Jean-Baptiste. If he wasn't a part of this, I'd be even more concerned about end. Antonio Carter, you had to bring in to solidify your safety depth chart because of issues you've had recruiting. So they're far from a finished product. However, you have to look and say, if this staff is on in their evaluation, and because they did it last year too with Boubacar and Armel Mukam and guys like that, but this year even more so, if they're on, then this is the staff that say, look, they can go out and find those type of sleepers, which is what Clemson did. They'd go out and get those kids. Some of them were big-time players, but some of them were the Isaiah Simmons and the Travis Etiennes and these guys that nobody really knew a whole lot about that they turned into really good football players. And so Notre Dame is basically banking on that. And they're banking on that with Cole Mullins and Logan Thomas and Sean Sevillano and Bryce Young and Bodie Cahoon and Bronte Johnson and Kennedy Urlacher and Leonard Moore. And if they're right, then this team is going to have a long, athletic, because again, these kids can run. Logan Thomas can flat out run. Cole Mullins plays middle linebacker half the time for his high school football team, and he moves like a really good linebacker. Moves. It's not what he's going to play at the next level, but you watch, he can run. Bryce Young is track guy at his high school. You know, he's got really impressive track times, and he's a guy that can run. Now, is he going to be a good football player? Don't know. We have no idea. But he's a guy that, again, we're talking about tools. And Notre Dame is looking for tools. Bryce Young, for example, and you guys want to hear something crazy? Bryce Young this year in outdoor track, he is 6'5", 250 pounds. He ran a 22.99 in the 200-meter dash. That's what he did, right? That's really impressive. Is he going to be a good football player? I don't know. We're going to find out. I have him as a 3.5-star kid with a 4.5-star upside. We're going to have to find out. So we're going to see. But the point is, they believe these kids have big-time upside. They believe that they passed on higher-ranked guys, higher floor guys for more talented players from a tools and an upside standpoint. That's what the staff believes. If they're right, we're going to look back at this 24-23 cycle, back-to-back cycle, as the stretch that turned the corner for Notre Dame. That's what they're banking on. If Notre Dame is a title contender consistently, if they go out and win a title in future years, if they're an elite football team, we're going to look back and say, man, that 23 and 24 stretch was big time. And wow, what a great job they did evaluating those players that turned into NFL guys that other people didn't think that they were. And that's what's on the line. And if they're wrong, then we're going to look back and say, you guys relied too much on your own evaluations, and you guys no, that's not the right way to say it, because you should always rely on your own evaluations. You guys were too willing to risk floor versus ceiling in the conversation, is what it comes down to. Should always go on your own evaluations. But you guys were too willing to take projects and didn't take enough floor guys. And that's what you have to change. We're going to find out what's the answer to that here in the future years. But this is a class, I will tell you that I know some people around the program that actually think this class, if they get Gearby Lambert, could be better than last year's class. I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's what I've had some people around the program tell me. And it's because they have a lot of faith in their evaluations of players. And if they're right, we're going to have a lot of fun covering this football team in future seasons. All right, so we're going to do a mailbag here, and I'm not going to add any more questions to it right now, because I'm just not going to be able to kind of go back and forth. Just so you all understand, the chat is in one area. I have to hit the start section to get to the questions that we're going to answer, and I can't keep coming back and forth. So I'm going to just get to the ones that you guys have already had, and we'll do this as long as my voice can handle it. Remember, we have a show at 5 o'clock tonight, so Sean and I believe Vince are going to be doing a show at 5 o'clock tonight, because we have a practice to get to tonight at 7 o'clock, which I'm very, very excited about. You have a super chat from Rob Osgood. Thank you, Rob. I can see Notre Dame between 9 and 13. Prove the town on the field, win games you're supposed to win, and win big games. That alone will shut ESPN and others up, in my opinion. This year is a toss-up in college football due to new quarterbacks. I agree with a lot of what you said, Rob. I think the 9 to 13 is fair. I had him 10th, so obviously I was in that range. And look, I think Notre Dame has better than the 10th. Their roster is better than 10th best, in my opinion. However, there are things that they have to prove. There's no doubt. There are things they have to prove before I can say they should be ranked where I think they're going to finish, or think they can finish, which is as a playoff team. They have a lot to prove before they're going to get there. I'm projecting it, but we got to see them actually do it. And there's a lot on both sides of the ball from a coaching standpoint, all of it. There's a lot they have to prove. But I just love the talent, Rob, and I know you do too. And now we're less than 3 weeks away from them getting their chance to go out and prove it, man. And I really can't wait for it. Can't wait for it. Got a super chat here. It says, off topic, Big Ten fans are fools. USC would drop UCLA before dropping its true rival Notre Dame. Pure joy when USC ruins Notre Dame seasons can occur with an average USC team. Okay. Another super chat here from Wicked Bronco Productions has a couple. He says, I don't know why Texas and LSU get more hype than Notre Dame when they all had the same amount of wins. All three had bad losses as well. LSU lost to Texas A&M and got drugged by Tennessee at home. Texas lost to a 6-6 Oklahoma State team, and the media forgets that. He also has another one. I'll just get to that. In my top 25, I have Notre Dame at 12, just based off of the last season. Getting into this season, Indy is very underrated. Sam Hartman makes so much more of a difference than the media thinks. He's not a gimmick QB. I'll be honest. Part of the reason that I'm somewhat, I don't crush people for having Sam Hartman as high as I think he should be, is because I didn't have him as high originally. I didn't. You could probably find, because when I make a statement that I change later, I don't go back and like delete it. And I made a comment to a guy when Sam Hartman was first kind of being mentioned, is like, I don't like it. I think he's a gimmick. I think he's a system quarterback. And I mean that in the sense of he's not really, the talent isn't the issue. He's not winning because of talent. He's winning because the system just generates numbers. And a couple of the games I'd seen him play, he didn't light the world on fire. And that can be an issue when you only watch a kid play a certain amount of times. Well, then I go back and I start really studying the film, and I broke down like 8-9 games over the last 2 years. And you're like, I was wrong. This kid is making the system better. That's the difference. Now, was his raw production a byproduct of a system that's very pass friendly? Yes. But he made the system better. He made the team better because of how he played. And if you don't, I mean, how many people do you think are studying Wake Forest games like that? Folks, I didn't until Sam Hartman was a guy that they needed to, that they were looking at. So I'm somewhat understandable to it. I think back to your original point, look, I get what you're saying about Texas. I completely agree with you. And I agree with you to a degree about LSU, but LSU did prove they could beat Bama, and you deserve some credit for that. But credit to the point where you're a top 5 team, like, to me, it's typical Brian Kelly, right? He loses to Tennessee in a blowout, chokes away a game to Texas A&M, gets blown out by Georgia in the SEC title game, and Notre Dame played Georgia twice when Brian Kelly was here, including a year where they were a playoff team, and Notre Dame lost by combined 7 points. He goes to LSU with this better roster, and they get stomped by 20. But you don't hear people talk about that. But he gets that big win that gets everybody excited over Alabama, and they just ignore all the other stuff. Well, the excuses. I mean, that's what I've complained about for years. It's the excuse making. Oh, well, we didn't win because this, and this. And LSU fans have already bought it hook, line, and sinker, man. It's like they'll talk out of both sides of their mouth, which is what Brian Kelly always forces defenders of his to do, is because you've got to argue in one sense, oh, no, this team is this, and this. But then in the other sense, you've got to then talk out, he's a great recruiter. Look what he did in the portal last year. Well, why'd you lose 4 games? Well, he inherited a bad roster. Okay, but you just got done telling me how talented the team is and how great he was in the transfer portal. So, which one is it? Well, it's whichever one allows me to defend Brian Kelly. And I saw Notre Dame fans do that tap dance for a decade. I even did it early in his tenure, to be honest with you. And then I just stopped saying, well, this is just, we have enough evidence now that it's just not true. But that's not the perception of Brian Kelly is great coach. And then there's a combination of him being a great coach, which I don't buy. He's a very good coach, but not a great coach, not an elite coach, combined with the hype of, oh, he's at an SEC school now and all that comes with that hype. And that's why he's ranked high. Texas has got a talented roster, and they're on the hype machine now too. And it's the pre-SEC hype of Texas, I think, is kind of what's going on a little bit there too. But to your point, yeah, I mean, their records are similar. Yeah, they beat Bama. Well, Notre Dame curb stomped Clemson, right? Well, they had a bad loss to Texas A&M. Well, Notre Dame had a pretty bad loss to Stanford. I would argue that the Stanford loss was worse than the Texas A&M loss. Now, of course, Notre Dame didn't get curb stomped by Texas A&M or by Stanford the way that LSU got smacked by Texas A&M, but it's still a bad loss. They lost to Marshall. So to me, they should all three be in a very similar spot, and that's exactly where I have them. I have them 9, 10, and 12 because I think they're all very talented teams. LSU is very talented. Notre Dame's very talented. Texas is very talented. They all have question marks, and they all have a lot to prove. And so I think they all could be bumped up. If we're talking best rosters, they're all easily top 10 teams, Texas, LSU, and Notre Dame. But they all have big question marks too and things that they have to prove, to your point. Riza, haven't seen you in a while, my friend. Thank you for the super chat. Thank you very much for the super chat. Love CFB and your show. Can't tell you guys how much I appreciate your work. Well, I appreciate your support, Riza. Very, very much, man. Very much. I do appreciate that a ton, a ton. We have a super sticker from Christopher Galloway. Thank you, Christopher, very much. We also have a super chat from Raymond Horton. Love these breakdown shows. Do you think we lose a game to one of the big three or trip up in one of the trap games? Thanks, go Irish. As of right now, I'm leaning towards them losing to Clemson. I would hope that they would lose to one of the trap games and then beat Ohio State, Clemson, and USC if they're going to have a loss. But as of right now, I'm leaning towards having Clemson being the team that Notre Dame loses to. Look, Marcus Freeman showed us last year that at home he can hang with you. He can and if not smack you. That's what he did to Clemson last year. But they had two big games on the road and they lost both of them. Can't discount that, right? We can't ignore that because they beat Navy or because they beat South Carolina in a bowl game or beat Syracuse. No, you had the two really good teams you played on the road last year, both beat you by 11. So that's still something Coach Freeman has to show that he can get his team ready to do, and that is to win that type of game. And he hasn't done that yet, which is why I have him where I have him and why I have Clemson as a loss. Now I think they certainly can beat Clemson, obviously, but you just can't say, well, because they beat them last year, they're going to beat them this year, et cetera, et cetera. Just football doesn't work that way. I mean, Notre Dame beat Stanford 45-14 at Stanford in 2021. They lost at home to Stanford in 2022. Georgia in 2017 got beat by Alabama or Auburn 40-17. 3 weeks later, they played in the SEC title game. Georgia beat them 28-7. It's you were the better team that day. As a bigger picture, they gotta prove to me that they can go on the road and beat that kind of team, and that's what that Clemson game is going to be about. I had a super chat from Beefeater. He says, a moment of silence in honor of Lou Emoji's birthday. I did not know that today was Lou's birthday. But yeah, we can honor that because you all know how much I adore Lou. And we have a super chat down here. Another one from Wicked Bronco Productions. Thank you very, very much. You give a lot of super chats, man. We do appreciate that. We don't always agree on things, but I love your willingness to come at me and combat and make your arguments. It is very appreciated. And of course, you give us a lot of super chats, which also appreciate. So you hit around the spot. I agree. I have LSU, ND, and Texas all around each other. I'm just tired of hearing Texas is back every year for them to underachieve. Why is this year different? Dave Clawson said Wake Forest only ran slow mesh 20% of the snaps. I don't know about that. I mean, I watched them do that a lot. I don't know if it's 20%. It seemed like a little bit more to me than that. But it's not just the slow mesh. Like, that's a lazy national publication analysis. Oh, it's the slow mesh. No, it's a spread it out, throw the ball over the field, vertically oriented spread offense that also does stuff off of the mesh. And you watch Sam Hartman's highlight film, there were some big time throws he made off of the mesh. You can't ignore that. But it's not the only time he made big time throws. I think the mesh thing is just the lazy way that people describe it. It's a spread offense that throws the ball down the field as much as any team in college football. And just they're a high relying on the pass game offense. Regarding Texas, I mean, look, they've got to prove it, right? I'm not going to argue with you on that. I have them 12th. It sounds like you have them in a similar range because you can't ignore the talent. And I don't think that it doesn't sound like you are, but to your point, Steve Sarkisian is a phenomenal offensive mind. We've seen that as a coordinator. He has not proven he's that kind of guy as a head coach. He didn't win at a big level at Washington. I think the most he ever won. Didn't he win 10 games like once? And I think that was at I know he had a 10-win season at USC because they beat Notre Dame one year. And I think he had like one 10-win year, no, eight-win team at Washington. They went 5-7, 7-6, 7-6, 7-6, 8-4. Then went 9-4 at USC. Then he got fired and he's 5-7, 8-5. So I mean, guys never put it like this. It took Steve Sarkisian until year 6 to win 9 games. Marcus Freeman did that in year 1. Right. So yeah, he's got a lot to prove as a head coach. I saw some things from that team last year that I liked, some things that concern me, and I do think the talent is outstanding. So I'm willing to give them the higher ranking, but I'm not at all willing to put them in the top 10 right now. Now they're going to get their chance at Bama, and they're going to get their chance in their conference. If they're going to be a playoff contender, they have to go toe-to-toe with Bama. They don't have to beat Bama at Bama, but it's got to be a 4-quarter battle. It has to be. if they're going to deserve being considered a playoff team. We are not Marshall, asked Brian, from your observations at practice and 20 days to go, have any of your concerns or perceived weak position groups changed, or too early to say? Well, it's too early for me to say from a what we have seen standpoint. The staff should be getting an idea of kind of who they are. They're almost at the halfway point now. We have a full practice tonight. I'll have a much better sense of it, And then one of the questions that we had down here from T Guns is along with that. So Marshall, I'm bringing this up to partly answer your question, because have you figured out which groups or players you're going to prioritize watching tonight? I'm watching a lot of the trenches tonight because I want to see the guards. I want to see how they're doing. I want to see how the D line is stepping up. That's the battle. I'm at Vince and Sean watching the skill players, and I'll watch the skill players during some drills and during one-on-ones. But when it's scrimmage period, I am watching the big boys, because to me, that's going to make or break this team, especially the defensive line. So they haven't answered my questions. They haven't alleviated it. I've seen some guys athletically moving around that look real good. I think the D-line is bigger than they were last year. I'm impressed with their size compared to recent seasons. They're athletic. They're moving around. But we've seen them scrimmage once, and that was day one without pads on. It's helmets and the little spider pads. It was not a full practice, like a full padded practice. So I really can't evaluate it. So what I'm trying to do this year is really stick to, here's what I'm seeing from guys athletically and how they're running around, how they look, and not getting into the sweeping, here's now what I think about this team at this position, or their defense is going to be this. I'm not changing my preseason views yet, because we just haven't seen that like live scrimmage, that, the one-on-ones, the 7-on-7s, the team stuff that I would really need to see to either solidify an opinion I have or change an opinion I have in one direction or the other. And that's just really where I'm at this point in time. Again, T Guns, who do you think you'll see the most improvement from tonight at day one at camp? I don't know. I hope it's some defensive linemen. That's what I'm hoping, just because of what I'm expecting from this team. But we'll see. We'll see. We got question down here out of OSU, Clemson, and USC, which is the biggest must win? It would be great to win all three, or at least two, but if you could be guaranteed one of them, which you feel is most important, why? Thanks. I think this is a really good question, and you could go a lot of different directions on this. You could say at Clemson, because it's later in the year and all these other type of things. If I could definitely guarantee that one, and then say you split the 2 home games, even if you mean you lose to Ohio State, that's a playoff resume, right? If you're able to split the home games, but then you end with Clemson, you could make that case. You could say, I want to guarantee beating my rival and all that. But to me, it's really a simple answer. It is. It's Ohio State. And not only does Ohio State give you a big resume boost this season, but Notre Dame's trying to be the best team in the country, right? You can't be the best team in the country if you're not even the best team in your region. And right now, that's still Ohio State, with all due respect to Michigan, who's made the playoff the last 2 years. Well, Notre Dame's made a couple playoff appearances too. Ohio State's the only team that's won a championship. They're the team that dominates the NFL draft. They're the team that consistently beats Notre Dame on the recruiting trail. Now, Notre Dame got a couple wins over them this year, especially the most recent with Kingston, which was huge. But if Notre Dame wants to be that team, they have to first be the best team in this region. And if you can beat Ohio State, because if you beat Ohio State this year and you look good doing so, it doesn't mean it has to be a blowout, but just you beat them by a touchdown, but it's like you were the better team. You can look back at the loss last year and say, we led that game more than we trailed. And that was the first game of Marcus Freeman's tenure at Ohio State with CJ Stroud versus a first-time starter. You could spin that one and you'd be correct. It would be spin, but it would also be accurate. So to me, that's the big game, because it's not only the resume builder that the other games is, but just from a perception standpoint, there's no game on the schedule that moves it more than that. If you beat Clemson again, it's like, okay, you beat them last year by 21. Now this is your third win over Clemson. You almost took Clemson's first championship game team to overtime at their place. You didn't even play that well. So yeah, okay, you beat Clemson. Whoop-de-doo, you've already done that. The national group doesn't respect Clemson the way they used to. USC, same deal. You've beat USC like 8 of the last 10, 12 times you've played, something like that, right? Yeah, they beat you last year with the Heisman Trophy winner, and you had a bunch of backups in the field, right? The Ohio State game is the one that would move the needle from a perception standpoint in a really, really big way. And that's really where I want to see Like that's just a big one for me, and it's first, and that's part of it too. But those reasons are bigger. Along those lines, David Lowe says, Brian, not if Notre Dame loses all 3 games, but loses 3 games, but they beat Ohio State and win their bowl game, would that be a successful year for me? It wouldn't. 9-3. If you're good enough to beat Ohio State, there's no excuse for you to lose to 3 other teams. None. Nope. Because the big win would change the perception, but if you go lose 3 games after that, the perception is now gone. You're Purdue 2018, you're Iowa 2017, you're Michigan State who beat Ohio State multiple times back early in the obviously the year with Luke Fickell, but then early in the Tressel years they beat them, or I mean the Meyer years beat them a couple times. That's who you are. You just had that one good day, but you didn't turn the corner. When I talk about you need to beat Ohio State, you need to beat Ohio State and then prove that you are that team, 11-1 or better, right? So, because that would mean you lose to Clemson and USC potentially, but then you lose to somebody else you have no business losing to, and most likely 2 of them at least are going to be after you beat Ohio State, and it takes away a lot of that excitement about beating them, in my opinion. Smile and Iris says, after 12 practices and based on your limited observations, how are you feeling about Tobias Merriweather? He does not seem to be getting a lot of press, and you made a mention of him needing to get stronger. Yeah, and he definitely needs to get stronger, and that was always going to be a thing. I don't know that we've seen a whole lot from him where we could give him a lot of press. I think he looks good athletically. He's playing well in the drills that we've seen him play. He's battling 2 of the best cornerbacks in college football every day. So we're going to have a lot better idea about him tonight for sure. But he's look, this is really the first fall camp. Like, this is the first time that Tobias is going into a period where he's the guy. He was still in kind of prove it mode, and he had Lorenzo and he had to prove himself in the spring, but now he's going into the season like as the dude with all the expectations. Part of the learning process in fall camp is how to handle that and how to continue developing and growing as a player, and that's where he's at right now. Irish Gordy Knott says, with Emil Wagner being next in line for the right tackle position, does he work closely with Blake Fisher, or does the line primarily work as a unit? I mean, they've worked side by side a little bit in some of the practices we've seen, because they've played Emil at right guard, left guard. They're moving guys around a lot. But also, you see Fisher, you see Zeke Corral really coaching the younger guys up a lot. So yeah, they're gonna work closely together. Andrew Gilmore says, what are your thoughts on the veer and shoot offense? Art Browse originated it, but not a lot of people run it. I ask because that offense turned Tennessee around overnight. Couldn't Indy ever run it? Could they? Sure. I'll be honest, I think that's an offense that works a lot better in the South. And the reason I say that is, and you can look at Ohio State a little bit the last couple of years, you start getting in that northern winter, the November, the wind, the cold, the snow, the rain. It's hard to do that sucker in November. And Ohio State last year goes to Northwestern, who was awful, and they struggled because they couldn't run the football and they couldn't throw the football. You're just going to get games like that. You just are. When you're playing Wisconsin and Minnesota and Michigan, and you're playing in Pennsylvania and Illinois and Indiana in October, November, especially November, you're just going to have games like that. It'd be tough to do that. I mean, you've got to recruit a certain type of player to that, obviously. It requires a certain level of play at quarterback, a level of precision at quarterback that makes the margin for error a little bit, interesting. And you've got to get certain type of athletes. And I just don't know if the other thing too is I don't know that type of system accents the things that you are the best at: tight ends, offensive line. That's where you're the best at recruiting. Look, could they do it if they had the right coach? Sure. I mean, you can do a lot of things if you have the right coach. It's just not what I think would be best for Notre Dame. And you say it turned Tennessee around. To a degree it did, sure. But, I mean, Tennessee had a great quarterback, and it turned them around statistically offensively, but they went 7-6 the year before. They haven't been great on defense the last couple of years. And yeah, they had some big wins last year, no doubt, but they've kind of faltered down the stretch, if we're being honest. And we'll see if they can finish strong. I mean, they're a good football team, but it's about sustainability. Can you do it over a period of time? The other part too, Andrew, is you're going into year 3 now where the teams in that league kind of have your film. They know what you're going to do. Can you keep it going? We're going to find that out. I'm not saying you can't. It's just that's part of the learning process to me. When you're saying, like, can a coach be successful with a certain system? It's like remember when Navy first jumped in the AAC, They dominated because teams didn't have a read on it. After a couple years, you got into it, and all of a sudden, now there's a book on you because you're playing the same teams over and over, and teams are able to establish some sort of, hey, what works? Because previously Navy would play like 3 teams the same every year, and that was it. They played Notre Dame, Air Force, and Army. That was it. Everybody else was kind of new, and it was harder to establish a book on them. And now they've just gotten worse and worse and worse and worse the longer they're in it. And then you look at what Heupel did at UCF. Same deal. First year, 12-1, went to the Fiesta Bowl. I think they were undefeated going into the Fiesta Bowl, correct? Didn't they lose to is that the year they lost to LSU or Auburn? Let me go look at their schedule real quick. Yeah, that's the year they lost to LSU. So undefeated, you go in there. The next year, you come back out, 2019. You're still good, but you're 10-3. You lose to Pitt. You lose to Cincinnati. You lose to Tulsa. You beat Marshall in a bowl game. You beat Stanford. Okay. And then you come out the next year, 2020, and they're 6-4. So again, the longer they're in that league, the worse they were. And Marcus Freeman especially started to get a read on that defense a little bit. And Marcus Freeman and Luke Fickell, because if you look at like 2018, when they played Cincinnati, let me find it was 30-13. Whooped them pretty good. The next year, they're 10-3. They play Cincinnati that year. They lose 27-24 in a game where Cincinnati played pretty good defense, if you remember correctly. Then you come out in 2020, you play Cincinnati again, you lose 36-33. Cincinnati had some really good plays on defense to stop that team, and all of a sudden they got a book on you. They get blown out by BYU. Tulsa had a really good defense that year, held them in check. So the more that you played those teams, the more they got a read on what you did, the more they were able to come up with an established plan to stop you. Now, he'll have better talent at Tennessee, but you got to admit, UCF usually had one of the most talented rosters in that league, and they got worse and worse every year that he was there. Will that happen at Tennessee? I don't know. I think there's other reasons that they faltered a little bit at UCF. He didn't inherit a great roster, in my opinion, in certain spots, but they had some injuries a couple times, but I just need to see him prove that can win over time. We've seen these gimmicky offenses, and I don't mean that disrespectfully. I should say unique offenses. That's a better way of saying it. We've seen these unique offenses have early success and then falter. The option, this type of thing. Art Briles was unique because he could do it, and they were just always good no matter where he went because he was one of the OGs of that, and he was just a wicked smart dude. Is Josh Heupel that guy? I don't know. We'll find out. But that would be my question, is it sustainable? And I don't know that it is, especially for a northern school. Brian Hockney says, what are your thoughts on the Aztec package? I don't have a lot of thoughts on it, Brian. It just sounds like a name for a different – so what these tend to mean is, so like I may have 2 nickel packages. One I would call, I don't know, let's say it's after like ancient civilization. So one's Aztec. And so what we learned that is because in the interview with Antonio Carter, he said he's in the game in the Aztec package. So let's say it's a bigger package. So you've got him in the game with 2 other safeties. And then let's say you have the Trojan package or, something along those lines, the Roman package, whatever, some ancient civilization. If you want to stick to that part of the country, the Inca package, something along those lines, right? Whatever. That's more of Thomas Harper, or you've got another package where it's a nickel package. So you're in a 4-2-5 or 3-3-5, whatever it is. We don't know the answer to that, but this name happens to be, let's call it this one Samurai. Okay. Well, this one's more of a 3 cornerback package. So your calls are going to be somewhat similar. It's more of a personnel thing. It's like I've used this before. If you have 21 personnel and then you have 21 speed, or you have 21 big, or whatever the case may be, it's probably more personnel related in certain situations than necessarily like this whole unique package. That's just my guess based on what coaches do, but that's just a guess because we haven't seen them do it. And honestly, if we do see them do it, I wouldn't talk to you about it because I'm not trying to give that away. I'd say, boy, this is a fun thing to watch, and that's about all you get, honestly, because I like having access to practice, and I don't want them to take it away because I told everybody in the world what they're doing defensively. Lance Hab says, are there any receivers separating themselves as the top targets for Sam Hartman? The only guy we've really seen Sam Hartman key on a ton is Chris Tyree so far. But again, we haven't seen enough to really have a strong opinion on that, and that's what I'm looking forward to tonight. John Lacey says, I'm very excited to see Jaden Greathouse. Me too. He seemed very good at finding the zone in the spring game and taking what they give. That seems different than the offense in the past. Do you concur? No, I think there's been elements of that in the past. He's just a little bit different body type, and he had a quarterback that throw him the ball. They had this up in the past. They just didn't always get the football in that certain situation. Let's see here. JP Buellsfeld said Notre Dame versus Army, November 2024, Shamrock Series. Does this make sense for last minute Miami cancellation? Has Notre Dame and is that something that you're suggesting, JP, or is that something that has like been announced? Okay, so that was already on the schedule, right? Back in 2021. No, I don't think that is anything to do with the Miami thing. The Miami thing happened this year. Let me just find the Notre Dame football schedule. Because right now Notre Dame has 11 games in 2024. Miami game's now off. Let's see here. The Army Notre Dame game is not listed on FBS schedules. Let me go look at Notre Dame's schedule and see if they have it. So give me just 1 second and I'll be able to look this up. Let's see here. Let me go to Notre Dame's main site. Did you guys see that they changed the it's now fightingirish.com instead of you? If you still go to und.com, it'll still take you to that, but they have it's now fightingirish.com. They don't have, let me see if I can find their future schedules. I don't see it here where Notre Dame lists their future schedule. So just give me a second. See if I can find it. I don't see it. I don't see what Notre Dame's future schedule is yet. Give me see our schedule, blue gold game. Yeah, I don't see anything here, and then this doesn't allow me to go to the 24 schedule. I have to look into that for you, JP. I'm not quite sure. Right now, according to FBSschedules.com, they only have 11 games at this point. We have something from 5 Burkhart Boys. Says, if we finish 9-3 again this year, does the Marcus Freeman recruiting effect fade? I feel like to make another jump, we need to finish 11-2. Anything less, I'm going to go backwards. Thoughts? Well, what happens in the bowl game? That would be my question for you. If they go 9-3, I'd be a little bummed and say, it's not great. It's still a step in the right direction because it's better than 8-4. You would hope that they would not go 0-3 against the big teams on the schedule. That would be a step back. But let's say they go 9-3 and they play an LSU or a team like that in a bowl game and win, then they take a step forward. Is it a big step forward? No. Is it the step forward that we want to see? No. Is it the step forward that I expect from this team? No. But it's still a step forward. And I don't think the recruiting effect fades incredibly because he could still say, guys, look, that's because we don't have our recruits in here yet. I don't love it when coaches say that, but you can still sell it. I think 9-3 with a bowl win would be a step in the right direction. It just wouldn't be a huge one, to be completely honest with you. And that would be kind of where I would say it's not an ideal season, but it's still a good step in the right direction, big picture, but I'd be disappointed with it, to be completely honest with you. Tom Frawley asks, how confident are you and Marcus Freeman making sure this team gets off to a better start this year as opposed to 2022? Very confident because it's a much more manageable schedule. If Notre Dame started the season off with Bama at Bama, would I feel that they're, or Georgia at Georgia, would I feel they're going to be off to a better start? No, I couldn't say that. But Navy and Tennessee State should allow them to do that. That's the reality of it. So because of the schedule, that alone makes me more confident in it. But again, now Coach Freeman has 13 games under his belt. He's got a second full offseason. You got better personnel at some very important positions. You're a more experienced team top to bottom than you were last year. So all those things make me confident in it. Charlie Weiss's last belt loop. Thank you for the super chat. And Tom, thank you for your super chat as well. Charlie, thank you for yours. Does Notre Dame win the national title with Johnny Football in 2012? No, they don't. No, I don't think that they do. Couple more questions here before we get out of here, everybody. David Lowe says, how many years did it take Brian Kelly to beat a top 5 team during his tenure? Well, it depends. Are you talking about like top 10 team or top 5 team from like when they were ranked? I think that would, actually, I don't. That's a good question because I don't know that they beat any top 5 teams early on. They didn't in 2011 or 2012 or 2010. 13, they beat a top 5 team in Michigan State, but Michigan State wasn't ranked in the top 5 at the time. Kind of like Stanford in 2012, they ended up the season ranked 7th, but they were 17th when Notre Dame beat them. Michigan State was unranked in 13, but they ended up third. So I count that as a top 5 win. So at the very latest, you're talking about 2013. And I think his next top 5 win, I don't think I'm going to look for this, but I don't think it came until 2020 when they beat Clemson. So 2017, they didn't have a top 5 win. Highest ranked win at the time of the game was 11. 18, Michigan was not ranked in the top 5. Stanford was ranked 7th. So that was the highest that year. 19, you didn't have Navy was the only ranked team that you beat. 2020, they beat number 1 Clemson. So I believe the first win over top 5 team of his tenure in a game of where that team was ranked in the top 5 at the time was Clemson in 2020. But I prefer to look at rankings of what you were at the end of the year. I think that's a better indicator of the quality of the opponent you beat. And that would be 2013 when they beat a Michigan State team that finished 3rd is where I would give that one to. Andrew Gilmore says, does Clemson take a step back on D in year 2 without Venables? Say what you want of him as a head coach. He could coach D. Oh, there's no question. He was an excellent defensive coordinator. I've always said, Andrew, being a great assistant coach doesn't make you a great coordinator. Being a great coordinator doesn't make you a great head coach. Being a great head coach doesn't mean you be a great coordinator. They're different jobs and different tasks. To me, do they take a step back? I don't think they take a step back this year, because I think they're going to be very talented on defense this year. I think they're in a better position to kind of just line up and play, which is what they do. I think the D coordinator they have, who I'm not a huge fan of, but he is going into year 2, so I have a little more experience. I think the big step back could happen next year because they're going to lose a lot of guys, and I don't know that the talent level will be replenished as easily as it is being replenished this year. That's where I think if there's going to be a drop-off, it'll be next year. And here's the last one that I'm going to probably get to today. Ryan Haley says, just out of curiosity, Brian, do you ever say you don't see what the staff sees in a prospect and disagree with a certain prospect commitment? I mean, everyone can't like every prospect. I kind of feel like I'm just going to give you the benefit of the doubt for the manner in which you're asking the question. Absolutely, including this class. I didn't love the Sean Silviano pickup. I didn't like Tabron Benny Powell. I talked about those vociferously. What I have done over the years is I have learned to tamper down the veracity with which I attack the staff, because what it has come across as is if you're a parent and I'm hammering Notre Dame for taking your kid, that's going to come across as an attack on your kid. And I have no problem being honest about a person's evaluation. I have no problem saying I don't think this guy's a Notre Dame caliber player. That's a fair evaluation. That's not personal. But if I'm saying, man, Notre Dame's coaching staff is a bunch of idiots for taking Tabron Benny Powell, that's not a criticism of, that's not a critique or an evaluation of Tabron Benny Powell. That's a personal attack on him. And even though it's not intended, that's why I've tended to be careful with how I be critical. But I'll flat out say, I don't think Sean Silviano is the player that Notre Dame thinks that he is. I hope that they're right, but I don't agree with it. I thought it was a mistake and said so publicly, taking Anthony Knapp over Caleb Brewer. I didn't love that pickup at the time. There's guys that Notre Dame was going to take last year that ended up missing out on that I didn't like as much. Tabron Benny Powell, as I said, is one that I talked about. So yes, I've absolutely done that. And if I believe that I'm not super high on Carson Hobbs, I hope I'm wrong about that, because I love Carson. He does the show with us, does Carson's Corner with us. But I got him as a 3.5-star player. I don't love that pickup, so I'll do that all the time. So perhaps you're new to the show, perhaps, and you don't know that, but absolutely. Look, here's the deal. I'll say to you, and I always promise you guys this: I don't work for Notre Dame. I don't answer to Notre Dame. I have had issues in the past with coaches at Notre Dame because I don't carry their water. If I tell you that a kid can play, in my opinion, and he's a 3-star kid or a kid with it's because that's what I believe, truly believe. If there's been kids that Notre Dame has got that's highly ranked that I just said, I know he's ranked high, but I just don't love that kid. So yeah, I'll absolutely do that, Ryan. And because at the end of the day, two things. Number one, I always want to be true to myself. I want to be able to put my head on the pillow at night and say I was honest in how I did my job, and did it within some level of integrity. I don't always speak to people in a way that I think condones my faith, that shows my faith. That's something I try to work on, but it's just kind of my personality. But I'll never tell you something because Notre Dame wants me to. I'll be honest. I've had Notre Dame coaches call me in the past and say, "Hey, can you write this article about this?" And I'll say, "No, I don't, because I don't believe that." But if they'll ask me a question, "Hey, could you write an article praising this recruit?" And I'll say, "Why?" "Well, we know you're high on that guy, and we're just trying to show him some love." Yeah, I'll do that because it's what I believe. I'll only ever write what I believe. And if if there's a coach at Notre Dame who doesn't want to talk to me because I criticize him as a coach, or a decision that he made as recruiting, then that's fine, because I don't answer to them. They're going to come and go, right? Y'all are always going to be here. The fans are always going to be here, and that's the second part of this. Is I care much more about being honest with you all than I care about being honest with Notre Dame. That's just simple as that, right? Because I don't work for them, right? Brian Kelly hated my guts for a long time. Guess what? I'm still here. He's not, right? So if I would have sold my soul to make him happy, then I would have lost y'all's respect when I changed my tune after he left. That's just the reality of it. So if I'm wrong, and I will be wrong, I'm going to be wrong about kids in this class. There was kids I was wrong about last year's class, one way or the other. You can always know that being wrong, it was an honest miss. I gave you my honest opinion, and I got the evaluation wrong, or I got the prediction wrong. I promise you'll always get that. And I appreciate your super chat on that, following up on that as well. So that's my commitment I always give to you guys. Whenever I give an opinion, now there's maybe times I don't tell you my full opinion because it's just not meant to be public. I may not tell you everything that I know and believe. I may say it in a way that tries to take some of the bite out of it that I used to have. I used to be, when I would criticize coaches when I first got into this, man, it was sharp tongued. And I just don't, a lot of things in my personal life. So I'll be critical, but just not in the really just, not to say nasty, because it was never personal, but just like really like over the top critical of it. I try not to be that way as much anymore. I don't mind, but I also don't mind being strong in my criticism. Just try not to make it personal. And that's what I try to do. So, hey, I don't think this kid's as good as Notre Dame thinks that he is, but here's what I like about him, and here's the good things that I see. And because every kid that's coming to Notre Dame has some skill that you like. Tabron Benny Powell is a kid that I flat out said, I don't see why Notre Dame took this kid. But I can also pop in the film and say, hey, here's some things that you can see what they like about him, right? He does this well. I think that's always a fair criticism, and always a fair way of saying is like, look, I don't like this kid. I don't have this kid graded as high as they do, but here's things I like, and here's things that he needs to improve upon. And then at the end of the day, I think we can all agree that if I don't think a kid can play, or you don't think a kid can play, I think the one thing we all agree on is that's one of those times where I hope I'm wrong. I'm not someone who has to be right all the time. I'm not. And when I don't think highly of something, that's when I like being wrong. I like being that I was wrong about Kyron Williams. Very happy about that. Not happy that I was wrong about Josh Barajas, because that was not good for Notre Dame. And so that's where I'm going to be. So anyway, that's going to do it for today's show, everybody. 5 minutes. We're going to have the IB Nation Sports Talk guys are moving their show up to 5 tonight. So when you're going to leave here, you're going to run over there. We are about 5 people away from getting to 3,000 subscribers for the year. That's our goal for the year. It actually was our goal for next year, but we're a year ahead. I want to get there. We had, just where our numbers are. If you have not signed up and you're waiting, sign up for the message board at boards.irishbreakdown.com. You'll love it. We got some fun things planned for the season. I'll have my practice report up there first tonight after the full practice. You'll love that. I'll be back tomorrow for another edition of the midweek rundown. Be similar to this with some different topics. I'm not sure when I'm going to do the practice report. I don't know if I'm going to do it tonight late, probably not. I don't know if I'm going to do an early show in the morning that I put up early, or if I just wait until the afternoon show. I haven't decided that yet. But either way, I'll have plenty of fun stuff to talk about tomorrow. So, hey, everybody, thanks y'all for joining us so very much. I appreciate y'all being with me, and we'll be back again here very, very soon. Head over IB Nation Sports Talk right now at 5 o'clock. Going to be a lot of fun, and we'll talk to you guys again very soon on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.